On the damp, overcast evening of the 12th of August, 1944, a young American military pilot stepped out of his quarters at Royal Air Force Station Furstfield in Norfolk, England. The air carried the familiar chill of the British countryside, thick with moisture and the distant, low rumble of idling aircraft engines. The pilot, a handsome, athletic 29-year-old lieutenant, pulled a cigarette from his pocket, struck a match, and took a long, slow drag. The glow of the cherry illuminated his face for a brief second, revealing eyes that were tight with a mixture of intense anxiety and fierce determination. He needed the nicotine to steady his hands, which had begun to shake slightly despite his best efforts to remain calm. He began walking across the tarmac toward a massive cavernous hangar on the far side of the base. Every step felt heavy, as if the ground itself were trying to hold him back. For weeks, he and his 35-year-old co-pilot, a fellow lieutenant nicknamed Bud, had been preparing for this exact night. They were the chosen crew for a highly classified Allied military initiative known as Operation Aphrodite. On paper, it was an innovative, cutting-edge tactical strategy designed to turn the tide of the war. In reality, among the handful of mechanics, engineers, and high-ranking officers who knew the details, it was widely considered a suicide mission. The young pilot, whose full name was Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr., tried to push the grim reality out of his mind. He focused instead on the reason he was standing on British soil in the first place. Like thousands of his countrymen, he had joined the military to defeat Nazi Germany. By the summer of 1944, World War II had been raging for nearly 5 grueling years. The Allied forces had successfully landed in Normandy on D-Day just 2 months prior, and the German army was undeniably losing ground. But a cornered beast is often the most dangerous, and Adolf Hitler's regime had grown increasingly desperate. To terrorize the British population and break their wartime resolve, Hitler had unleashed a terrifying new campaign of technological terror. He called them Vergeltungswaffen, vengeance weapons. These were long-range, unmanned ballistic missiles and rockets, most notably the V-1 flying bombs, and the development of even larger underground artillery systems. Unlike traditional aerial bombing runs, these weapons were launched arbitrarily from heavily fortified positions across the English Channel in occupied France. They rained down indiscriminately on major civilian population centers, primarily London. By August, these vengeance weapons had already slaughtered over 5,000 British civilians, turning residential neighborhoods into smoking craters of debris and flesh. Right at that very moment, as Joe walked toward the hangar, Allied intelligence believed that the Germans had massed a devastating arsenal of these weapons at a massive, heavily fortified underground bunker complex in northern France. The site was aimed squarely at the heart of London, prepared to deliver a knockout blow that could kill tens of thousands more. The sole objective of Operation Aphrodite was to eliminate this catastrophic threat before it could be launched. Despite the staggering danger of the assignment, Joe had aggressively volunteered for it. It was a choice that baffled many of his fellow aviators. Joe was a seasoned patrol bomber pilot who had already flown his required quota of 25 combat missions. By all military regulations and traditions, his tour of duty was complete. He had earned the right to pack his bags, board a transport ship, and return home to the safety and comfort of his wealthy family in the United States. Instead, he had turned down the ticket home, actively seeking out a mission so hazardous that other pilots did everything in their power to avoid it. To understand why Joe Kennedy Jr. would make such a reckless gamble, one had to understand the family that raised him. Joe was the eldest son of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., a wildly successful, deeply influential, and fiercely ambitious American businessman and diplomat. Joe Sr. ruled his household with an iron fist and an unyielding philosophy. The Kennedys must always be the absolute best at everything they attempted. Failure was not tolerated, second place was viewed as an embarrassment, and an intense, relentless rivalry was actively nurtured among the children, particularly between Joe Jr. and his next youngest brother, John. From the day he was born, Joe Jr. was the undisputed golden boy of the family. He was the eldest, the tallest, the most conventionally athletic, and the one anointed by his father to fulfill the ultimate family legacy. Joe Sr. openly boasted to friends, politicians, and journalists that his eldest son was destined to become the first Catholic president of the United States. Joe Jr. embraced this destiny wholeheartedly, molding his entire life, education, and early political ambitions to match his father's grand design. Then came the 7th of December, 1941. The surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor thrust the United States into the global conflict, and both Joe Jr. and his younger brother John, whom the family called Jack, enlisted in the military. Joe became a naval aviator, while Jack joined the Navy to command a patrol torpedo boat in the Pacific Theater. For the first few years of the war, Joe's position as the favored son remained secure. But then, disaster struck Jack's boat, PT-109. In the dark of night, a Japanese destroyer rammed the small wooden vessel, cutting it in half and killing 2 crew members. Jack, despite suffering a severe, debilitating back injury in the collision, showed extraordinary courage. He swam for hours through shark-infested waters, towing a badly burned crewman by a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth, ultimately leading his surviving men to safety on a deserted island. When the news of Jack's heroism reached the United States, it became a massive national media sensation. Jack was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal and the Purple Heart. His exploits were detailed in newspapers and magazines across the country. Suddenly, the spotlight shifted. In the Kennedy household, Jack was no longer just the skinny, sickly younger brother who lived in Joe's shadow. He was a certified, decorated American war hero. Joe Sr.'s attention shifted subtly but profoundly, praising Jack's bravery. For the first time in his life, Joe Jr. felt a deep, gnawing sense of insecurity. He felt as though he had fallen out of favor with his demanding father, replaced by his younger brother. The fierce sibling rivalry that had been baked into him since childhood flared up with painful intensity. Joe became consumed by a desperate, driving need to prove himself, to perform a feat of such undeniable heroism that it would eclipse Jack's medals and restore his status as the rightful heir to the family's political empire. When the call went out for volunteers for a top-secret, highly experimental, and immensely perilous mission in England, Joe saw his opportunity. He would become the hero who saved London. He would change the course of history. Joe flicked his cigarette butt onto the tarmac, watched the sparks scatter in the breeze, and pushed open the heavy personnel door of the hangar. The space inside was colossal, illuminated by harsh overhead industrial lights that cast long, dramatic shadows across the concrete floor. Positioned directly in the center of the hangar was a massive 4-engine heavy bomber, a consolidated B-24 Liberator. This was Joe's aircraft for the night. On the surface, the B-24 was incredibly familiar to him. He had spent the last 3 years logging hundreds of hours in the cockpits of Liberators, mastering their heavy controls, and understanding their aerodynamic quirks during dangerous anti-submarine patrols over the Atlantic. But as Joe walked around this specific bomber to conduct his pre-flight inspection, he could see that this aircraft was radically different from any B-24 that had ever rolled off an assembly line. It was a bizarre, heavily modified anomaly, a one-of-a-kind experiment that felt profoundly unnatural to a trained pilot. The most jarring modification was the cockpit canopy. Normally, a B-24 cockpit was enclosed by a complex framework of heavy glass windows designed to protect the flight crew from the biting, sub-zero winds of high-altitude flight. On this plane, nearly all the glass had been entirely stripped away. The only piece remaining was a single solitary pane of safety glass directly in front of the pilot's seat, functioning exactly like the windshield of an open-top sports car. It was, essentially, a convertible heavy bomber. The mechanics had removed the glass for a very specific, unsettling reason. When the time came, Joe and Bud would need to evacuate the aircraft as quickly and seamlessly as possible. With no canopy in the way, they could simply stand up from their seats and throw themselves out into the rushing wind. Joe continued his walk around and noticed that all the defensive armaments had been stripped away. The heavy .50 caliber machine guns that normally bristled from the nose, tail, belly, and waist turrets were completely missing. In their place, the mechanics had installed wooden broomsticks, carefully carved and painted matte black to mimic the appearance of weapons from a distance. Removing the heavy guns, ammunition tracks, and hydraulic turrets saved thousands of pounds of weight. But the saved weight wasn't intended to make the plane fly faster or carry more fuel. It was done to accommodate the terrifying secret that lay hidden within the hollowed-out fuselage. The entire interior of the aircraft, the bomb bays, the radio compartment, the waist gunner stations had been completely packed with boxes upon boxes of a highly volatile, state-of-the-art military explosive called Torpex. Torpex was 50% more powerful than standard TNT. The mechanics had crammed exactly 21,170 pounds, nearly 11 tons of this explosive material into the belly of the plane. This B-24 was no longer a traditional bomber meant to fly to a target, drop its payload, and return home. It had been meticulously transformed into a giant, lumbering, piloted flying bomb. The concept of Operation Aphrodite was born out of technological frustration. The Nazi underground vengeance weapon bunkers were protected by dozens of feet of solid reinforced concrete and buried deep beneath natural hillsides. Standard Allied bombs simply bounced off the roofs or exploded harmlessly on the surface. The military theorists believed that the only way to crack these impenetrable fortresses was to crash an entire heavy bomber packed to maximum capacity with high explosives directly into the structures. Because the remote control technology of 1944 was incredibly primitive, it was impossible to safely take off a plane carrying 11 tons of explosives via radio control. A human crew was required to manually pilot the lethal drone off the runway, climb it through the turbulent lower atmosphere, and guide it to its cruising altitude over the English coast. Once the plane was safely airborne and on course, an accompanying mothership, a Ventura bomber flying closely behind, would engage a radio control link to take over the steering of the B-24 using experimental television cameras mounted in the drone's cockpit, monitor the instrument panel. Once the remote link was confirmed, Joe and Bud would arm the massive explosive payload, make a final radio confirmation, and immediately bail out over the English countryside, parachuting down to safety. The remote operator in the mothership would then guide the pilotless flying bomb across the English Channel and crash it directly into the German bunker in France. At approximately 5:55 p.m., Bud Willie walked into the hangar carrying his parachute rig. He looked at Joe, and the two men shared a quiet, knowing nod. There was very little need for small talk. The sheer weight of what they were about to attempt hung heavily in the air. Both men were visibly sweating, their flight suits damp despite the cool evening air. They climbed up through the open belly hatch and squeezed into the cramped, stripped-down cockpit. Joe slid into the pilot's seat on the left, and Bud took his place on the right. After completing a frantic series of pre-flight checks, Joe received the final green light from the control tower. He reached forward and engaged the starter switches. One by one, the four massive Pratt & Whitney radial engines roared to life, coughing out plumes of blue-gray smoke before settling into a deafening, synchronized thrum that vibrated through the metal frame of the plane and deep into the bones of the two pilots. Joe looked out through the open sides of the cockpit down at the ground crew. The mechanics, engineers, and officers who had spent weeks working on the plane were standing in a loose line along the hangar walls. Not a single person was smiling. Their faces were grim, pale, and etched with an intense, somber reverence. They looked at Joe and Bud as if they were looking at ghosts, fully aware that the slightest spark, the smallest atmospheric bump, or a minor mechanical failure could instantly vaporize the aircraft and everyone within a mile radius. Sensing the palpable dread radiating from the ground crew, Joe forced a wide, confident grin across his face. He leaned out of the open cockpit, flashed a cheerful, theatrical wave, and gave a sharp thumbs up to the men below, performing the role of the fearless, unflappable leader he believed his father wanted him to be. But beneath the bravado, Joe's stomach was tied in knots. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. He was terrified. By 5:59 p.m., Joe released the heavy toe brakes, and the massive, overweight B-24 began to roll forward, trundling out of the hangar and onto the taxiway. The true weight of the 11 tons of Torpex became immediately apparent. The aircraft felt incredibly sluggish and unresponsive, handling less like an airplane and more like a massive waterlogged barge. Every single seam, rivet, and metal plate in the fuselage creaked and groaned under the immense stress. Every minor bump and crack in the concrete runway caused the plane to lurch and bounce violently. Inside the cockpit, Joe and Bud held their breath with every shudder, painfully aware that they were sitting directly on top of a mountain of highly volatile explosives. Joe lined the heavy bomber up with the center line of the main runway. He took a deep breath, looked over at Bud, who gave a firm nod, and then pushed the quad throttles all the way forward to full power. The engine screamed in protest as the plane began its agonizingly slow acceleration down the strip. It used up almost the entirety of the runway, eating up thousands of feet of concrete as Joe fought the controls to keep it straight. Finally, just yards before the tarmac gave way to the grass fields at the edge of the base, Joe pulled back on the control yoke. The wings bit into the air, and the lumbering flying bomb reluctantly broke its connection with the earth, clawing its way up into the sky. As they gained altitude, Joe looked out of his open canopy and saw 6 other aircraft rising to join him. These were the escort planes, a mix of USAAF fighters to protect them from any rogue German Luftwaffe attacks, and the specialized Ventura motherships equipped with the top-secret radio control gear. The small armada formed a tight, protective echelon around Joe's B-24 as they leveled off at their designated cruising altitude of 2,000 feet. For the next 15 minutes, a surreal calm settled over the cockpit. The flight across the southern expanse of England was smooth and uneventful. The cold wind whipped fiercely through the open sides of the cockpit, tearing at their flight jackets and forcing them to communicate via their intercoms, but the engines ran perfectly. Joe watched the familiar rolling green patchwork quilt of the British countryside slip away beneath his wings. Ahead, the shimmering gray-blue expanse of the English Channel began to materialize on the horizon, glowing faintly under the setting evening sun. The moment of truth was rapidly approaching. The primary target for the mission was located roughly 120 miles south, situated just outside the small village of Mimoyex in the northernmost tip of France. Unknown to Joe and Bud, the entire premise of their dangerous journey was a catastrophic failure of military intelligence. 5 weeks earlier, on July 6, the British Royal Air Force had launched a massive conventional bombing raid against the Mimoyex site. Utilizing legendary Tallboy ground-penetrating bombs, 6-ton monsters designed to shake the earth like a localized earthquake, the British had successfully collapsed the underground galleries, destroyed the V-3 Vengeance supercannons, and permanently neutralized the entire facility. The German garrison had completely abandoned the ruins. There was no functioning threat to London left at Mimoyex. The Reich's vengeance weapons at that location had already been neutralized. But because of a breakdown in Allied communication and photographic reconnaissance analysis, the American commanders had no idea Joe and Bud were flying a doomed mission to destroy a target that had already ceased to exist. At 6:15 p.m., as the plane cruised near the coastal village of Blytheburg, it was time to hand over control of the aircraft. Joe reached forward and toggled the heavy mechanical switch on his dashboard that engaged the remote control receiver. For a terrifying, agonizing second, the B-24 shuddered violently, its nose dipping sharply toward the earth as the automated internal gyroscopes fought for balance. Joe and Bud froze, their hands hovering over the manual controls, ready to grab them if the system failed. But within moments, the plane leveled out, tracking straight and true. A crackle of static echoed through Joe's headphones, followed by the calm, steady voice of the remote operator flying in the Ventura mother ship just a few hundred yards away. The operator confirmed that the radio link was fully secure. He had complete control over the B-24's steering, altitude, and throttles. Joe slowly pulled his hands back from the yoke and removed his feet from the rudder pedals. The plane was flying itself. There were now only two final tasks left for Joe and Bud to perform before they could leap from the open cockpit and parachute safely into history. First, they had to manually arm the 11 tons of Torpex, transforming the passive cargo into a live, highly sensitive weapon that would detonate upon impact with the French hillside. Second, Joe had to transmit a highly specific, pre-arranged code word over the radio channel, Spade Flush. This code would signal to the entire escort fleet that the explosives were live, the mission was fully operational, and the crew was bailing out. Joe turned around completely in his pilot's seat, twisting his torso to face the auxiliary bulkhead panel located directly behind him. This panel contained the master arming assembly, a complex array of wires, fuses, and a heavy industrial toggle switch. Once this switch was flipped, a low-voltage electrical current would flow directly into the multiple detonators buried within the Torpex payload. It was the point of no return. Joe looked at the switch. His hand hovered just inches away from the cold metal lever. A wave of profound, suffocating dread washed over him. He knew with absolute certainty that what he was about to do was the most dangerous act of his entire life. The margin for error was non-existent. If something went wrong, there would be no warning, no time to react, and no survival. He thought of his father waiting across the Atlantic for news of a great victory. He thought of his brother Jack wearing his medals and absorbing the adulation of the family. Joe took a deep, shuddering breath, steeled his resolve, and reached out. He flipped the switch. Immediately, he grabbed his radio microphone, keyed the transmitter, and spoke the final words into the static, Spade Flush. What the brave crew of the Flying Bomb could never have known was that a catastrophic error had been made days prior during the frantic, hurried modification of the aircraft's electrical systems. A technician working in the cramped, dark belly of the plane had accidentally crossed a pair of crucial wires, insulation rubbed thin by the constant vibrations of the airframe. The arming system had been plagued by a fatal vulnerability to stray electromagnetic interference. The exact fraction of a second that Joe flipped the switch to live arm the system, a stray radio signal, likely the powerful transmission from the nearby Ventura mothership trying to send a control command, crossed into the exposed wiring. Instead of merely preparing the fuses for a future impact detonation, the electrical current bypassed every safety mechanism and shot straight into the primary explosive train. The detonation was instantaneous. In a microsecond, the 11 tons of Torpex exploded with an apocalyptic fury that defied comprehension. The blast didn't merely break the B-24 apart, it completely vaporized it. A massive, blinding fireball erupted over the quiet village of Blytheburg, lighting up the twilight sky for dozens of miles in every direction. The shockwave was so violent that it severely damaged several of the escort planes flying hundreds of yards away, nearly knocking them out of the sky. On the ground below, the residents of Suffolk felt the earth shake as if struck by a massive earthquake. Over 3,000 homes in the surrounding countryside sustained damage, their windows shattered and roofs caved in by the sheer concussive force of the explosion. Debris from the aircraft, tiny, twisted fragments of aluminum and charred metal, rained down over a 3-mile radius, sizzling as it fell into the marshlands and fields. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. and Wilford Bud Willey were killed instantly, utterly obliterated in a flash of light before their brains could even register the failure. They never felt pain. They never had time to realize that their mission had failed. No recognizable remains of either man were ever recovered from the crash site. In the immediate aftermath, the tragic loss of the Aphrodite drone had absolutely zero impact on the progression or outcome of World War II. The war in Europe continued its relentless march toward Berlin, concluding 9 months later with the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. The destruction of the empty, abandoned bunker at Mimoyex was quickly forgotten in the grand calculus of global conflict. But the catastrophic failure of that secret flight altered the course of American history in a profound, permanent, and staggering way. When the devastating news of Joe Jr.'s death reached the Kennedy family estate in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, it completely shattered Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. The grand, decades-long political strategy he had meticulously constructed for his family was instantly reduced to ash. His golden boy, the chosen son who was supposed to carry the Kennedy name all the way to the White House, was gone. But the patriarch's intense, unyielding ambition did not die with his eldest son. It merely shifted. With Joe Jr. gone, the crushing weight of the family's destiny fell squarely onto the shoulders of the second son, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Prior to the tragedy of 1944, Jack had absolutely no desire to enter the brutal, cutthroat world of American politics. He was a sickly young man who suffered from chronic health problems, and his true passions lay in literature, journalism, and history. He had planned to pursue a quiet, intellectual career as a writer or a university professor, content to live his life far away from the public eye while supporting his older brother's political campaigns. Years later, reflecting on the profound turning point of his life, John F. Kennedy would openly admit to close friends and associates, "Joe was the star of our family. He was the one who was going to go into politics. If he were alive, I would have been a writer. I never would have run for office." But the family dynamics allowed for no vacuum. Spurred on by his grieving father's relentless pressure and a deep, solemn sense of duty to fulfill the legacy of his fallen brother, Jack reluctantly stepped into the political arena. He took Joe's place. In 1946, utilizing the same campaign apparatus and financial backing that had been originally built for his older brother, Jack ran for and won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. His political rise was meteoric, fueled by his charismatic personality, his genuine intellect, and his status as a highly decorated war hero, the very status that had inadvertently driven his older brother to volunteer for that fatal flight over England. By 1952, he was elected to the United States Senate. And in November of 1960, John F. Kennedy accomplished the impossible. He defeated Richard Nixon in one of the closest elections in American history to become the 35th president of the United States. He became the first Catholic to ever hold the office, fulfilling the exact prophecy his father had spoken decades earlier. The ripple effects of that single mechanical malfunction in the cockpit of a B-24 bomber in 1944 fundamentally rewrote the narrative of the 20th century. Had those wires not been crossed, had Joe Kennedy Jr. safely bailed out of that plane, he would have returned home to become the political juggernaut of the family. John F. Kennedy would have remained a private citizen, a journalist covering the events of a world he wasn't shaping. Without the JFK presidency, the modern world would look entirely unrecognizable. A different leader would have sat in the Oval Office during the terrifying heights of the Cold War, facing down the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where a single miscalculation could have triggered a global thermonuclear holocaust. The trajectory of the civil rights movement, the early and fateful escalation of American involvement in the Vietnam War, and the grand, audacious political will required to launch the Apollo space program to land a man on the moon were all deeply, inextricably tied to the specific character, decisions, and rhetoric of John F. Kennedy. The entire global landscape was irrevocably reshaped because one night in 1944, an ambitious young pilot took a deep breath, reached out his hand in the dark, and flipped a switch. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Strongsville, Ohio used to be one of those quiet, comfortable suburbs you see all over America. A place with nice homes, nice families, and a local mall. But in late 2017, something was discovered there that put the town on the map for all the wrong reasons. And to really understand what happened, we need to go back to early 2016, which is when this town's long nightmare really began. In early 2016, a couple named Bruce and Melinda Pleskovich, who had lived in Strongsville for a long time, got some very exciting news. Their 20-year-old daughter Anna and her 20-year-old fiance, a young man named Jeff, had just told them they were expecting a baby. It was going to be a little girl. And so, Bruce and Melinda were absolutely thrilled. They were finally going to be grandparents. But at the same time, they were a little worried. They knew that Anna and Jeff didn't have a lot of money. Anna was still living at home with her parents. She had a job as a waitress at the local Applebee's, but it didn't pay much. And as for Jeff, he had a decent job. He was a service technician for a heating and air company, but it wasn't enough to support a new family. In fact, he was still living with his own parents on the other side of town. So here you had this young couple so excited about their new baby, but Bruce and Melinda knew they needed some help. They knew their kids just weren't financially prepared for this huge step. So Bruce and Melinda talked it over. They decided the best way they could support Anna and Jeff was to make them an offer. They told Anna that she could invite Jeff to come and live with them in their house. That way, the two of them could be together, and once the baby was born, Bruce and Melinda could be right there to help out. It seemed like the perfect solution. It would let the young couple save up their money so they could eventually get a place of their own. When they told Anna about their plan, she was so happy and so grateful. She immediately called Jeff, and he was just as thrilled. He said yes, he would love to move in. So it took a few months to get everything sorted out, but finally, in June of 2016, Jeff moved out of his parents' house and into the Pleskovich home. And it was in that very same month that Anna and Jeff welcomed their baby daughter into the world. But almost as soon as Jeff moved in, some really strange and disturbing things started happening around the property. Just a few days after Jeff had settled in, he and Anna were home alone. They were on the main floor, having dinner at the kitchen table. At some point, Jeff just happened to glance out one of the back windows that looked out into their backyard. Now, their property had this huge, sprawling backyard. It was almost like a big, open, communal space shared by a row of houses. So Jeff is looking out into this big yard, and he sees something strange off in the distance. It was dark out, so he couldn't quite make it out at first. He stood up and walked over to the window for a better look. And as he got closer, he could see them. Way off at the back edge of their property, there were 4 strangers. They were just standing there, looking like they were smoking something, and they were all staring up at the Pleskovich house. Jeff just stood there at the window, watching them, not sure what to think. He called Anna over to the window, and she came and stood next to him. The two of them are just looking out, trying to figure out what to do. On one hand, these four people they didn't know were clearly trespassing on their property. But on the other hand, they weren't really doing anything aggressive. They were just standing there, smoking and staring. Hot was then as they watched, one of the four people started walking up the property straight towards their house. The person stopped next to the family's trampoline, which was in the backyard, and started fiddling with it. At that point, Anna had seen enough. She said she didn't know what they were doing, but she felt totally uncomfortable. So she decided to call the police. The police came out, but by the time the squad car pulled up in front of the house, the four people in the back must have seen the flashing lights. They had taken off running. When the officer went into the backyard to look around, there was nobody there. And there was no sign that they had been there either. No cigarette butts, no footprints, nothing. They had just vanished into the night. The police officer told Jeff and Anna to call again if they came back, and then he left. A little while later, Bruce and Melinda got home, and Anna and Jeff told them what had happened. They all agreed it was incredibly strange. In all the decades they had lived in that house in Strongsville, they had never had anyone just wander onto their property and hang out in the middle of the night. For the next couple of days, the whole family was on edge, constantly checking the windows. But after a little while, as more time passed, the incident was mostly forgotten. Fast forward about 5 months to November of 2016. Anna was home alone one day with her young daughter. She was on the first floor towards the front of the house playing with the baby, and as she was playing, she suddenly heard a sound coming from the back of the house. It sounded like someone was trying to open the sliding glass door. Her first thought was that it must be Jeff or one of her parents. Maybe they forgot their key or something. So she scooped up her daughter and started walking towards the back of the house to let them in. She walked into one of the back rooms, and before she even reached the door, she happened to look out one of the windows that faced the backyard. And what she saw made her freeze. Standing right there, with his face pressed up against the glass, was an unknown man. He was just staring into the house. Anna just stood there, completely frozen, staring back at him. Then the guy noticed her. He immediately ducked down out of view. Anna's mind was racing. This must have been the person who was trying to break in through the back door. She was home alone with her baby, and she had no idea what this man wanted or if he was going to try to break in again. So she just turned and ran. She ran back towards the front of the house, up the stairs, and into a bedroom. She locked the door behind her and called the police. But again, by the time the police arrived and searched the area, they couldn't find anyone. There was no sign of an attempted forced entry on the door either. The officers told her that they were sure it was a traumatic experience, but there was really nothing they could do. There was no evidence, and they had no idea who it could have been. They just told her to keep her doors locked and to call them back if she saw anyone suspicious on her property again. Naturally, after the police left, Anna called Jeff and her parents. They were horrified and rushed home to comfort her. After the initial shock wore off, the family started to wonder. They thought, do you think this could be connected to those 4 strangers they saw on the property a few months ago? It just seemed too weird to be a coincidence. But then that led to the bigger question, who were these people and what did they want? Why were they targeting their family? As far as they knew, the Pleskovic family didn't have any enemies. In fact, most people in Strongsville absolutely adored them, especially Melinda, the mother. For over 20 years, Melinda had been a middle school teacher in town, and her students loved her. She was also a huge part of the local soccer community. She had played in college and was still really passionate about it, so she was an amazing coach. And for many of the parents in Strongsville, Melinda was an inspiration. She wasn't just a mother to Anna, she was also the mother of an 18-year-old boy named Kyle who had Down syndrome and was nonverbal. And Melinda just had this unbelievable way with him. She was so good to him, she included him in everything, and she gave him the best possible life. Anytime you saw Kyle with his mother, he was just beaming with happiness. Even though he couldn't speak, it was so obvious how much he loved his mom. But regardless of who these strangers were or why they were lurking around, the Pleskovic family was now completely on edge. They found themselves constantly looking out the windows, especially at night, terrified that these people were going to come back and try to break in again. And unfortunately, they did come back. In January of 2017, just 2 months after Anna saw that man at the window, Bruce's car was broken into. It had been parked in their driveway. Someone got inside and stole his laptop. So Bruce called the police again. He told them he was sure this was connected to the people who were harassing his family. The police seemed to believe him, and they started looking around and asking questions, but they never found the laptop or the person who took it. And so once again, the family was left on their own, and the police just said to let them know if anything else happened. A few months went by, and then in July of that year, Anna, Jeff, and their daughter were all home together one night. Anna happened to look out one of the back windows on the first floor. And there they were again. Out at the very back of the property, in the exact same spot where she and Jeff had seen those 4 strangers a year before, were 3 more strangers. They were just standing there, looking up at the house. Horrified, Anna called out to Jeff, telling him there were people in the backyard. This time, Anna pulled out her phone and started calling the police. But as she was on the phone, Jeff got really upset. He was tired of these people harassing his family and making them feel unsafe in their own home. So he grabbed a flashlight and stormed out the back door to confront them himself. But as soon as Jeff stepped outside, before he could even shine the light on them, the 3 people turned and ran, vanishing into the darkness. So when the police finally showed up, they were already well aware of all the calls they'd been getting from this family. They went out and did a serious search of the area, but just like every other time, they found nothing. And so the family was told, once again, to call if they saw anything else. The very next month, in August, Anna was home with her daughter. Her mother, Melinda, was upstairs. Anna was in the playroom at the front of the house with the baby when she heard it again. That familiar sound of someone trying to open the back sliding glass door. Immediately, her heart started pounding. She knew what happened the last time she heard that sound. But she thought to herself, okay, I can't just immediately call the police. I need to at least look and see if it's someone I know. So she picked up her daughter, stood up, and walked to the edge of the room she was in. She carefully peeked her head around the corner, down the hallway that gave her a clear view of the back sliding glass door. And when she finally saw who was there, she screamed. There were 2 large adults standing at the back door, actively trying to force it open. When she screamed, the 2 strangers heard her. They turned around and took off running. Melinda, who was upstairs, heard her daughter screaming and came flying down the stairs, trying to figure out what was wrong. Anna was hysterical, the baby was crying, and so Melinda was the one who called the police, this time to report what her daughter had just seen. The police came out, they searched the property, and they couldn't find anyone. So again, the police left. They told the family they were sorry this was happening, but they couldn't do anything without more evidence. They promised they would get out there as fast as they could if anything else happened, hoping that one of these times they would finally catch these people. But for now, they just didn't have much to go on. The next month, in September, one of Melinda's car keys went missing. And whoever had stolen it started using it to randomly start her car in the middle of the night. They also used it to set off her car alarm at all hours. During that same time, they also discovered that someone had jammed nails into the tires of Bruce's car. Of course, the family called the police and told them what was going on, but there was still nothing the police could do. Melinda was getting desperate. So she actually went on Facebook and made a post telling everyone that someone had stolen her keys and pleading for them to just give them back. In the post, she begged whoever was harassing her family to just leave them alone. But unfortunately, the post didn't do any good. The harassment continued. A month later, on October 19th, Jeff was home alone when he heard the sound of the back sliding glass door rattling. Now, he knew that every time Anna had heard that sound, there was always some stranger at the back door. So, Jeff grabbed the family dog and he very carefully peered down the hallway towards the back door to see who was there. And right as he poked his head out, he saw him. It was a large adult figure wearing a hood, trying to open the door. The dog saw the person and started barking, running towards the door. Jeff ran after the dog. The person outside, trying to break in, saw the dog and Jeff running towards him, so he turned and ran away. Jeff and the dog stayed inside the house and just watched the guy take off across the property and disappear into the trees. Jeff called the police, but just like all the other times, they came out, and there was simply nothing they could do. Just 4 days later, on October 23rd, Jeff, along with his young daughter and Bruce, went to the local Applebee's where Anna worked. They were going to have dinner there and have Anna be their waitress. After they finished eating, they said their goodbyes to Anna, left the restaurant, got in their cars, and drove back to the house. When they got there, Bruce was the first one up the steps to the front door. It was locked, so he knocked. His son Kyle came and unlocked the door for him. Bruce went inside, followed closely by Jeff, who was carrying his daughter. They got inside, and Bruce walked through the house to the kitchen at the back. He flipped on the lights, and he saw something on the kitchen floor. When Jeff saw it, he immediately turned around and ran out of the house, carrying his daughter. He grabbed Kyle on the way out and just took them straight outside. Once Jeff was safely outside, he called 911. And when you listen to the recording of that call, it sounds like Jeff is in total shock, unable to even process what he has just seen. He told the operator that someone had been attacked in his house. He said it was Mel Pleskovich. He said he didn't know who did it, that they just came home and found her on the kitchen floor. Jeff and Bruce had just discovered Melinda. She was lying on the kitchen floor. She had been stabbed over 35 times and shot 3 times. She was rushed to the hospital, but she would die that night. The whole family was in shock, completely unable to process what had just happened. But they were all convinced of one thing. Whoever had done this to Melinda had to be connected to all of those strange and suspicious people who had been lurking around their property for almost 2 years. In fact, right after Jeff called 911, while he was still inside the kitchen kneeling next to his dying wife, Bruce made his own call to 911, and in it, he blamed the police department for not doing more. He told the operator to please come, that he thought his wife had been killed by someone. He said they'd had people breaking into their house all year, and now someone had killed her. The Strongsville Police Department came out in full force for this case, and they would solve it in just 4 days. And when they finally went public with who killed Melinda, no one in the community could believe it. It turns out that on October 23rd, the night Melinda was found, Jeff had been at the house with her, her son Kyle, and his own young daughter. At some point that evening, before he went to Applebee's, Jeff had put his daughter down in her playpen. Then he went into the kitchen where Melinda was. He walked up to her, pulled out a knife, and stabbed her over and over again more than 35 times. Then, when Melinda fell to the ground, Jeff pulled out a gun and shot her 3 more times, just to make sure she was dead. And while he was doing this, his own daughter was just a few feet away in her playpen, and Kyle was also nearby, completely unable to understand the horror that was happening to his mother. With these 2 innocent children so close by, Jeff cleaned off his weapons. He took off his bloody clothes and hid everything inside of his car. Then he just scooped up his daughter and left the house, leaving Kyle all alone inside with his dying mother on the kitchen floor. He just left him there, shut the door, locked it, and then drove with his daughter to Applebee's to have a perfectly normal dinner with Melinda's husband and daughter. After several hours, when they got back to the house, Jeff knew exactly what was waiting for them inside. And he still let Bruce go in first to be the one to discover his own dying wife on the kitchen floor. Very little is known about why Jeff did this, because Jeff has never given his motive for the crime. The main theory is that Jeff was in serious financial trouble. The wedding was just a couple of days away, and he wasn't going to be able to pay for it. The wedding venue had apparently called Melinda to let her know that they were canceling the wedding because her future son-in-law couldn't afford it. And so, the theory goes, Melinda confronted Jeff about his money problems, and he just snapped and killed her. But that can't possibly be the whole story, because it would turn out that Jeff was responsible for every single suspicious event that had taken place around the Pleskovic property leading up to the murder. That means every time they saw strangers lurking in the backyard, or every time someone was trying to break into the house, it was all because of Jeff. Either it was literally Jeff himself outside, pretending to be a suspicious person, or he had asked his friends or even hired people to go onto the property and pretend to be stalking the family. Other times, Jeff was the only one who supposedly saw these people, and then miraculously, by the time anyone else looked, they were gone. He was lying. A childhood friend of Jeff's, who was living in the area when this all happened, said that the generally accepted reason in Strongsville for why Jeff did this was because he hated Melinda. Even though she had opened up her home to him, he loathed her. And as soon as he moved in back in 2016, he started plotting to kill her. All of those suspicious events, all of that harassment, it was all Jeff's attempt to build this incredibly intricate alibi. He wanted to create this narrative that a group of dangerous strangers was targeting the family. That way, when he finally killed Melinda, everyone would think it was them. And at first, it worked perfectly. Everyone believed it, from the police to the family to their friends. Everyone thought that strangers had finally broken into the house and killed Melinda. There was so little suspicion on Jeff immediately after her murder that he actually served as a pallbearer at Melinda's funeral. But ultimately, the police would discover the knife and the bloody clothes hidden in the back of Jeff's car. They arrested him and presented him with a mountain of evidence. And Jeff confessed to killing Melinda. However, he wouldn't give any additional information about the crime. He just said yes, he did it. He also never offered any kind of apology or explanation to the family. He was ultimately sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 33 years. During Jeff's trial, there was a completely heartbreaking moment when Bruce, Melinda's husband, spoke. He said that their son, Kyle, doesn't understand that his mother is gone. And so now, every time they go out to eat, which is something Kyle loves to do and used to love doing with his mother, he'll just sit and stare out the window. He just sits there, eagerly expecting his mother to show up at any minute. But of course, she never does. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the morning of Tuesday, the 13th of July, 1993, a nurse named Sharon Dempsey was making her way down a long hallway at the Mahiri Hubbard Hospital in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. She moved with a purpose, her steps quick and efficient as she checked in on her patients. But on this particular morning, she was also on a mission. She was searching for one patient who had a habit of wandering away from her room. As Sharon reached the end of the hallway, she peered into the last room and let out a small sigh of relief. There, inside, was the woman she had been looking for. Her name was Mildred Lancaster. She was 69 years old, and at that moment, she was busy sweeping the floor of another patient's room. She was using a broom that Sharon recognized immediately, one that Mildred had likely swiped from a custodian's cart she'd found in the hallway. Sharon walked into the room and gently approached the older woman. She asked her, "Mildred, what are you doing here?" Mildred turned, a look of simple purpose on her face, and she replied that she was just doing her job. But of course, this wasn't her job. Mildred wasn't an employee of the hospital. She was a patient. She had been admitted just 2 days earlier, suffering from severe stomach pain. But that wasn't her only issue. Mildred also experienced extreme bouts of confusion, which was exactly what Sharon was witnessing right now. The nurse had to hide a small, weary smile. This had become a familiar routine. Mildred's family had explained her history to the hospital staff when she was admitted. For most of her life, Mildred had worked as a housekeeper. It was a job she took pride in, a role that had defined her for decades. And so now, when her mind would get clouded with confusion, she would often revert back to that familiar identity. She would think she was at work, even when she was at home, or in this case, in a hospital bed. Her family had seen it many times. She would suddenly get up and start tidying things, convinced she was on the clock. Because of this behavior, the hospital staff had considered using physical restraints to keep Mildred safely in her room. The fear was that she might wander into a restricted area or hurt herself. But Mildred was such a sweet and gentle soul. The idea of tying her down just felt wrong to everyone involved. So, the medical team decided on a different approach. They would have to accept that from time to time, Mildred was going to believe she was a housekeeper again. She would likely leave her room and go looking for something to clean. The plan was simple. Keep a very close eye on her, make sure she was safe, and continue to treat her stomach pain while managing her disorientation. So, in this moment, finding Mildred with a broom in her hand, Sharon just followed that protocol. She spoke to her in a calm, gentle voice and said, "Okay, Mildred, you can put the broom down now. Come with me." Mildred, ever agreeable, listened. She set the broom against the wall, and Sharon gently led her by the arm, walking her back down the hall to her own room. After making sure Mildred was settled, Sharon continued with her rounds, the small incident already fading from her mind. A couple of days went by. Sharon was once again doing her regular rounds, moving from room to room, checking charts, and speaking with patients. When she arrived at Mildred's room, she pushed the door open and saw that it was empty. The bed was neatly made, but Mildred was nowhere in sight. At first, Sharon just felt a wave of annoyance. By this point, Mildred had wandered off so many times that it was becoming a bit of a hassle. It wasn't alarming anymore, just another small task to add to her already busy day. Sharon followed the usual procedure. She left the room and began walking the floor, checking other patient rooms, utility closets, and common areas, expecting to find Mildred tidying up some corner of the hospital. But this time was different. After a full sweep of the entire floor, there was no sign of her. Sharon went back and started her search again, this time being much more thorough. She looked in every supply closet, every empty room, every nook and cranny she could think of. Still nothing. That's when the annoyance started to curdle into real concern, a knot of panic tightening in her stomach. She started approaching other nurses and doctors, her voice a little more urgent now. She asked them, "Have you seen Mildred Lancaster?" By now, most of the staff on the floor knew about Mildred and her habit of wandering, but no one had seen her. Not a single person. Realizing this was now a serious situation, Sharon went to her superiors and informed them that one of her patients was missing. Immediately, the hospital launched a full-scale search. Security personnel and staff members fanned out across the entire building, a sprawling 11-story complex. They searched inside and out, checking every floor, every wing, every possible hiding place. Sharon tried to help, walking around and telling the search teams where Mildred might be likely to go. She told them to focus on areas that looked messy or disorganized. She explained that when Mildred got confused, her instinct was to find clutter and clean it up. So people started checking storage rooms, renovation areas, and anywhere else that might have looked untidy to Mildred. But the hospital was massive. There were countless messy areas, and the task of searching them all felt overwhelming. To make matters worse, the hospital had no security cameras. They couldn't just rewind some footage to see if Mildred had walked out one of the doors. There was no digital trail to follow. After an hour of frantic searching, they had found nothing. The hope of finding her quickly was beginning to fade, and people started to wonder if they would find her at all. It was at this point that the situation took a strange and concerning new turn. As part of her duty, Sharon called Mildred's cousin to let the family know what was happening. She explained that Mildred was missing, and that this time, it was serious. But as Sharon was breaking the news, the cousin stopped her. She said, "Wait a minute. I think I know what's going on." It turned out that a few hours earlier, the cousin had actually come to the hospital to visit Mildred. When she arrived and spoke to the receptionist at the front desk, she asked for Mildred's room number. The receptionist looked up the name in the system and then gave the cousin some surprising news. The computer showed that Mildred Lancaster had been officially checked out of the hospital that very morning. This new information completely changed the situation. The massive search was pointless if Mildred wasn't even in the building. But to Sharon, it made absolutely no sense. Mildred was in no condition to be discharged. She was still sick, still suffering from stomach pain, and her confusion was as bad as ever. There was no way a doctor would have signed off on her release. Yet, the cousin was certain. The receptionist had told her Mildred was gone, so the cousin had turned around and left without ever going upstairs. Sharon hung up the phone, her mind racing. She quickly walked down to the main lobby to talk to the receptionist herself. She asked the woman to look up Mildred's file, and sure enough, the system confirmed it. Mildred Lancaster had been discharged. Sharon stood there, stunned. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could this have happened? Who would have authorized it? Not knowing what to do next, she walked away from the desk and went over to a large window that overlooked the busy streets in front of the hospital. She just stood there, watching the cars speed by, trying to process this bizarre turn of events. And then, a horrible thought entered her mind. What if Mildred, in her confused state, had somehow managed to wander down to the front desk and convince someone to discharge her? What if she had then walked out the front doors and was now wandering aimlessly through the city? She could have been hit by a car. She could be hurt, lying somewhere, unable to call for help. The situation had suddenly become a true emergency. Sharon knew what she had to do. She had to call the police. Not long after, police officers arrived at the hospital and they brought search dogs with them. Almost immediately, one of the dogs picked up Mildred's scent right by one of the main front doors. The dog then led its handler down the sidewalk and along the street, which seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears. Mildred really had left the hospital and wandered off. The police launched a massive search of the surrounding area. Officers canvassed a full square mile around the hospital, and a helicopter was brought in to scan the area from above. The search for Mildred went on for days, but it was fruitless. There was no sign of her anywhere. She had vanished without a trace. Then, almost 2 weeks later, the search came to a tragic end. On Wednesday, July 28th, 13 days after Mildred had disappeared, a security guard was doing his daily patrol through a construction site. As he walked along the edge of the site, he noticed a long, thin hole in the ground. It was about 5 feet deep, a trench that had been dug to lay some new pipework. The guard probably wouldn't have given it a second thought, but for some reason, he decided to walk over and look down into it. As he peered into the darkness, he gasped. Down at the bottom of the trench, he saw Mildred. It turns out, on the day she disappeared, Mildred had indeed become confused. She believed she was a housekeeper again, and she had left her room to go find some work to do. She began wandering through the hospital, moving from floor to floor. Surprisingly, nobody stopped her. She was such a pleasant and gentle woman that people who saw her probably just smiled and assumed she knew where she was going. After wandering for quite a while, going up and down different flights of stairs, she eventually found her way to the construction site. But to her confused mind, it wasn't a construction site. It was just a terribly messy area that was in desperate need of a good cleaning. There were pieces of wood, scraps of plastic, and debris scattered everywhere. So, Mildred got to work. She spent some time tidying the area, picking up debris, and trying to make things orderly. As she worked her way towards the back of the site, she failed to see the deep, narrow trench in the ground. She took a step and fell inside. Because she was so disoriented, she likely didn't even understand what had happened. She wouldn't have realized she had fallen into a hole and needed to climb out. In that dark, confined space, her confusion would have only deepened. She may not have even tried to escape. And so, she remained in that hole, undetected, for 13 days, until she eventually passed away. But perhaps the most tragic part of this entire story is that Mildred had never actually left the hospital. The construction site where she was found was located on the 10th floor of the hospital. That entire floor was being renovated, and she had simply meandered her way up there. All of those search parties, all of those police officers, they had all been looking for her outside. Even the teams that searched inside the hospital had been to that construction site. They had walked right past the very hole where she was lying. But they hadn't thought to look down into it. And Mildred, assuming she was still alive when they were nearby, was too confused and disoriented to call out for help. She just stayed quiet in that hole, and so she was never found in time. To this day, it's still not known why her hospital records showed that she had been discharged. Some believe it was a simple clerical error, a mistaken entry in the system. Others think it might have been a computer glitch. And the police dog that picked up her scent and led the search away from the hospital, that also remains an unexplained anomaly. Mildred's family later sued the hospital for $13 million in damages, but for reasons that were never made public, they eventually dropped the case. On the night of the 12th of January 1964, a police sergeant named Neil Johnson stepped into a small apartment in Los Angeles County, California. He was followed by a team of other officers, and as soon as they crossed the threshold, they were hit by two things at once: a blast of intense dry heat and a truly terrible smell. It was the smell of decomposition, and it didn't take them long to find the source. There, on the living room couch, was the body of a man. He was clearly deceased, and had been for some time. Sergeant Johnson and his team had been called to the apartment by the building's landlord. Other tenants had been complaining for days about a foul odor coming from this specific unit, and the landlord had finally called the police to investigate. Based on the information the landlord had already provided, the police had a good idea of who the man on the couch was. The apartment was rented to a 8-year-old man named Eugene Meadows. Eugene was new to the building. In fact, he had only moved in 6 days earlier. He was also new to the area, having relocated from about 8 hours away to start a new job. This meant it was very likely he didn't know many people in town yet. Sergeant Johnson and a few other officers moved closer to the couch to get a better look at the body. Right away, two things became apparent. First, it was clear that Eugene had not died recently. Based on the state of his body, he had probably been dead for at least a couple of days. And second, there was a very distinct hole in the back of his head. It looked for all the world like a bullet wound. But as Sergeant Johnson began to survey the rest of the apartment, he realized that the bullet hole didn't make any sense. For starters, the entire apartment was incredibly neat and clean. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no indication of a robbery or a break-in. Everything was in its place. The landlord had also told the police something crucial. When he had first come to check on the apartment after the smell complaints, he had found the front door locked from the inside. He also checked and found that all of the windows were closed and securely locked as well. This presented a major problem for the murder theory. If Eugene had been shot, the killer would have had to lock the door from the outside as they left. This would mean they had a key. It was possible they took it from Eugene, but given that he was so new to the area, it seemed unlikely he had given a key to anyone. The alternative theory, that Eugene had taken his own life, seemed even less plausible. The biggest problem with that idea was the complete absence of a gun. If he had shot himself, the weapon should have been somewhere nearby, on the couch, or on the floor next to him. But it wasn't. The officers conducted a thorough search of the entire apartment, looking in every drawer, closet, and cabinet. There was no gun to be found. Sergeant Johnson and his team were completely baffled. It was a classic locked room mystery. The scene didn't point to murder, and it didn't point to suicide. It just didn't make any sense at all. Rather than speculate further at the scene, they had Eugene's body transported to the local coroner's office for an autopsy. They hoped that a medical examination would provide the answers they so desperately needed. However, when the coroner examined Eugene's body, the case only became stranger. The first and most shocking discovery was that the coroner could not find a bullet anywhere inside of Eugene's head or his body. There was also no exit wound. Typically, when someone is shot, the bullet either remains lodged inside the body or it passes all the way through, creating a second hole. Eugene had one hole in the back of his head, no exit wound, and absolutely no bullet. It was a physical impossibility. In addition to this major anomaly, the coroner noted two other strange details. The first was that Eugene had something called a calcium ridge on the back of his skull near the location of the hole. This is a harmless genetic trait, where a small section of the skull is harder but also more brittle than the surrounding bone. It was something he would have been born with and likely never knew he had. But, given its proximity to the wound, the coroner made a special note of it. The second strange finding was the color of Eugene's internal organs. When the coroner examined his abdomen, he saw that the organs were a bright, vibrant cherry red. At first, the coroner wasn't sure if this was significant. It was unusual, but it didn't immediately point to a cause of death. But as he continued to puzzle over the case, unable to make sense of how Eugene had died or how he got the hole in his head, his mind kept coming back to those red organs. Suddenly, he had an idea, a theory that was wild but might just explain everything. He contacted the police and asked Sergeant Johnson to go back to Eugene's apartment and check for one very specific thing. He told him that if it was there, the entire mystery would be solved. Sure enough, Sergeant Johnson and his team returned to the apartment. They followed the coroner's instructions, and they found exactly what he had suspected would be there. And just like he'd said, it explained everything. It turned out that what happened to Eugene was not a murder, nor was it a suicide. In fact, there had been no shooting at all. The coroner's suspicion, sparked by the sight of those bright red organs, was that Eugene had died from carbon monoxide poisoning. This type of poisoning is known to cause a victim's internal organs to turn that distinctive cherry red color. When the police went back to the apartment, they discovered that the building's heater was old and faulty. It was leaking, and it had been slowly filling Eugene's small, sealed apartment with poisonous carbon monoxide gas. The mystery of how Eugene died was finally solved. But that still left the question of the hole in his head. The explanation for that was even more bizarre. After Eugene had passed out on his couch from the gas, the carbon monoxide continued to build up in his system. One of the effects of severe poisoning is that it can cause the brain to swell dramatically. As Eugene's brain began to expand inside his skull, it pushed against the bone. And because he had that unique calcium ridge on the back of his head, that area of his skull that was harder but also more brittle, the pressure had to go somewhere. As his brain continued to swell, the immense pressure eventually caused that brittle section of his skull to shatter. His brain essentially blew out a small portion of the back of his head, creating a wound that looked exactly like a gunshot hole to the naked eye. It was a tragic, one-in-a-million accident that had created the illusion of a violent crime. One afternoon in the spring of 1998, a 64-year-old man named Klaus Schmidt was walking through the international terminal of the Dublin airport in Ireland. As he made his way through the bustling crowds, he was gripped by a powerful and unsettling feeling of nervousness. He couldn't shake the idea that getting on his flight that day was a very, very bad idea. When he finally spotted his gate at the far end of the terminal, that vague nervousness intensified into a sense of genuine dread that washed over him completely. Now, Klaus was generally an anxious flyer. He never enjoyed the experience, but this was different. He had never felt this kind of deep existential fear before boarding a plane. This was a new and terrifying feeling. When he reached his gate, he saw the other passengers lining up, showing their tickets, and walking down the jet bridge. The sight of them boarding the plane almost triggered a full-blown panic attack. He stood, frozen for a moment, his mind screaming at him to turn around. A voice in his head told him to just listen to his gut, to not get on this plane. He could just go back to the ticket counter, book a flight for the next day, and this horrible feeling would go away. But as he stood there, paralyzed by fear, the logical side of his brain began to fight back. He told himself that he was just being ridiculous. He was a nervous flyer, and his anxiety was getting the better of him. There was nothing to be worried about. The flight would be short, and it would be over before he knew it. He was just overreacting. So, even though he couldn't completely shake the feeling of dread that was now a tight knot in his stomach, he decided to override his instincts. He took a deep breath, walked up to the gate, had his ticket scanned, and forced himself to board the flight. About an hour later, the plane had taken off and was cruising high above the Irish Sea. Klaus was in a window seat. He cautiously raised the plastic shade and looked out. The sky was clear, the water below was calm and beautiful. He glanced around the cabin at the other passengers. People were reading, chatting quietly, or dozing. Everyone seemed perfectly relaxed. There was absolutely no reason to think anything was wrong. But still, Klaus could not get rid of that awful feeling. He just wanted the plane to land, for this whole ordeal to be over. He knew he couldn't make the plane go any faster, so he tried to do some breathing exercises to calm his racing heart. He breathed in slowly, held it, and then breathed out. At first, it seemed to be working. His anxiety began to ebb just a little. But over the next 10 or 15 minutes, something new started to happen. Klaus started to feel like he was having a hard time breathing. It felt as if the air was getting thin. He discreetly looked around the cabin again, trying to see if anyone else was struggling, if maybe there was a problem with the cabin pressure. But everyone else still looked completely fine. It was just him. The difficulty breathing grew worse, and he started to sweat. He was rocking back and forth in his seat now, consumed by an anxiety he couldn't control. Then, a new symptom appeared. He started to feel an intense tightness in his chest, a crushing pressure that was both painful and terrifying. His first thought was that he was having the worst panic attack of his life. His anxiety had finally spiraled completely out of control. He fumbled to take off his jacket, unbuttoning the top of his shirt, hoping to get some relief. He was now dripping with sweat, and the passengers sitting near him were starting to notice. They were giving him concerned looks, but no one had said anything yet. Klaus tried to tell himself to stay calm, but it was impossible. The tightness in his chest got so bad, so intense, that he realized this probably wasn't just anxiety. This felt like something much more serious. This felt like a heart attack. The moment that realization hit him, it was as if all of his symptoms became 10 times worse. The pain in his chest was unbearable, and he felt his consciousness begin to fade. The world around him started to go dim. He could hear the muffled sounds of other passengers near him yelling for help. He heard a flight attendant rush over and her voice calling out urgently to the rest of the plane, asking if there were any doctors on board. As Klaus drifted further and further into unconsciousness, his last coherent thought was that his intuition had been right all along. Something terrible was going to happen to him on this plane. And before he could think anything more, his vision went completely blurry and he faded into total darkness. But it would turn out that Klaus's powerful intuition was actually only half right. While it was true that something terrible did happen to him on that flight, he really did suffer a massive heart attack. It was his decision to ignore that intuition and get on the plane that actually saved his life. Because this particular flight, by an incredible stroke of luck, was carrying 40 of the world's leading heart specialists. They were all flying home from an international cardiology conference. And it gets even more unbelievable. They just happened to be carrying samples with them of a brand new experimental heart drug, one that was not yet available to the general public. So when Klaus collapsed and the flight attendant called out for a doctor, not one but 40 doctors all raised their hands. One of them rushed over to Klaus's side, quickly diagnosed the heart attack, and immediately administered the new life-saving medication. Against all odds, the very flight he was terrified to board was the only place on Earth that could have saved him at that exact moment. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the evening of the 13th of January, 2002, a 42-year-old man named Ronald Huff walked through the door of his studio apartment in the city of Newark, Delaware. The air outside had been crisp and cool, but the moment he stepped inside, a wave of oppressive heat hit him. It was how he always kept it, blazing hot, a detail that seemed odd to anyone who visited, but for Ronald, it was normal. He'd just returned from a visit with his grandmother, a weekly ritual for him, but today was different. He felt deeply, profoundly sick. A strange weakness was creeping through his limbs, and a dizzy spell was making the room tilt slightly. Ronald worked at a local auto dealership. He was a quiet guy, a hard worker who mostly kept to himself. His coworkers knew him as reliable, if a bit of a loner. He didn't talk much about his personal life, and no one really pressed him on it. He'd come in, do his job, and go home. That was Ronald. So for him to feel sick enough to consider missing work was a big deal. He shrugged off his heavy coat, the one he wore even on milder days, and tossed it without looking onto a nearby object. It landed draped over one of the many handmade wooden cages that were scattered around his small living room, almost like pieces of furniture. There were cages of all sizes, some stacked, some sitting alone, creating a strange labyrinth in the cramped space. He dragged his feet across the floor, his body feeling heavier with each step, until he reached the kitchen counter where his landline phone sat. He picked up the receiver, the plastic cool against his clammy skin, and dialed the number for the dealership. When the office manager answered, her voice cheerful on the other end, Ronald's was weak and strained. He explained that he wouldn't be able to make it in the next day. He was feeling really unwell, he told her, not offering any more details. He hung up the phone and leaned heavily against the counter, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to fight off the lightheadedness that was washing over him. The heat in the apartment suddenly felt suffocating. Then a sound from behind him cut through his dizzy haze. It was a low, guttural hiss. It was a familiar sound, one he heard a dozen times a day, and it was a sound that meant someone was hungry. Without even thinking, Ronald turned and walked over to his refrigerator. Instinctively, he reached out with his right hand to grab the handle and pull the door open. But the second his fingers wrapped around the handle and he applied pressure, a sharp, shooting pain jolted up his arm. He winced, pulling his hand back. He'd forgotten. His right hand was wrapped in thick, white bandages, covering a nasty injury he'd gotten a week earlier. Grimacing from the pain, he switched hands, using his left to open the heavy fridge door. The cool air that spilled out was a momentary relief from the stifling heat of the room. After grabbing what he needed, he shut the fridge and walked back over to the kitchen counter. Next to the phone was a large glass jar. He unscrewed the lid and plunged his hand inside, pulling out a whole fistful of live cockroaches. They were huge, each one about 2 inches long, their legs and antennae wriggling frantically against his palm. He walked a few steps away from the counter and simply opened his hand, letting the cockroaches drop to the floor. They hit the linoleum with a series of soft clicks and scattered in every direction, disappearing into the shadows under the cages and furniture. That was one chore done. With the feeding finished, Ronald decided he just needed to lie down. The sickness was getting worse. The dizziness was back with a vengeance. As he started to walk across the kitchen, heading towards his bedroom, the world suddenly began to spin violently. The floor seemed to drop out from under him, and he could barely keep his balance. He felt a wave of nausea and weakness so profound that his legs started to buckle. He tried to keep moving to just make it to his bed, but his body wouldn't cooperate. He stumbled, then stumbled again, his steps clumsy and uncoordinated. He lurched sideways, throwing his arms out blindly to try and catch himself. His outstretched arm hit something solid, and his fingers found the edge of his apartment door. He grabbed onto the doorknob, his knuckles white, trying to steady himself and stay on his feet, but it was no use. The strength was just gone from his body. He turned, pressing his back hard against the solid wood of the door, hoping it would hold him up. But he was so woozy, so incredibly weak, that his legs finally gave out. He slid down the length of the door, a slow, uncontrolled slump to the ground. He ended up sitting there, his back pressed against the door, his legs splayed out in front of him on the floor. His head felt heavy, too heavy to hold up, and it lolled to one side. Slowly, his eyes fluttered and then closed. As Ronald Huff lost consciousness, the last things he heard were the familiar sounds of his apartment. The faint, skittering footsteps of roaches scurrying across the floor, and the distinct, wet crunch of chicken bones being crushed. 3 days passed. In the apartment next door, Ronald's neighbor was watching television when he heard the distinct crackle of police walkie-talkies out in the hallway. Curious, he got up and opened his door a crack. He saw 2 uniformed police officers and the building's superintendent standing right in front of Ronald's apartment. The neighbor liked Ronald. He thought of him as a nice, quiet guy who never caused any trouble. He couldn't imagine what the police would want with him. But then he thought about it and realized he hadn't seen or heard Ronald for several days, which was unusual. Normally, he'd hear him moving around in there. The neighbor watched as one of the officers knocked firmly on Ronald's door. "Newark Police!" the officer called out. "Mr. Huff, are you in there?" They waited. No answer. They knocked again, louder this time, their knocks echoing in the quiet hallway. Still, nothing. After a few minutes of this, with no response from inside, the police officers stepped back. They gestured to the superintendent, who fumbled with a ring of keys before finding the right one. He inserted it into the lock, turned it, and the lock clicked open. The superintendent stepped back, and the officers moved forward to open the door. One of the officers pushed, but the door only moved an inch or two before stopping abruptly. It felt like something heavy was blocking it from the inside. The 2 officers exchanged a look. They put their shoulders into it, pushing together with all their weight. The door groaned and scraped against whatever was on the other side, finally opening just enough for them to squeeze their heads through the gap. The neighbor watched as the officers peered into the dim apartment. A moment later, they both recoiled, jumping back into the hallway so quickly they almost tripped over each other. Their hands immediately went to the guns on their hips. One of the officers grabbed the radio on his shoulder and started talking frantically into it, his voice low but urgent. Then, the neighbor watched as both officers and the superintendent quickly walked away down the hallway and out of sight, leaving Ronald's apartment door hanging partially open. As the distant wail of sirens grew closer, the neighbor's curiosity got the better of him. He took a cautious step out of his own apartment and into the hallway. From his new vantage point, he realized he could see directly into Ronald's apartment through the open door. What he saw in that brief glimpse was so bizarre, so horrifying, that for a long moment he just froze, his mind struggling to process the scene. A second later, the shock wore off and was replaced by a wave of revulsion. He scrambled back into his own apartment and slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. Hours later, the neighbor couldn't shake the image from his mind. It was seared into his memory. He grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and just started sketching, trying to get the grotesque scene out of his head by putting it onto the page. It would turn out that Ronald Huff had a secret, a very big secret. And on the evening of the 13th of January, 2002, right after he called in sick to work, that secret had killed him. The picture the neighbor drew showed what the police had seen. On the floor, slumped against the door, was Ronald's body. But it was horribly mutilated. His face, his ears, and his hands had been chewed away. His abdomen was torn open, and his internal organs were gone, completely eaten. And surrounding Ronald's body were the culprits. They were giant monitor lizards. He was secretly keeping 7 of them as pets inside his tiny studio apartment. He fed them a diet of live roaches and raw chicken and just let them roam free. They were massive, ranging in size from 2 feet to an incredible 6 feet long. Unfortunately for Ronald, monitor lizards are not just carnivores, their mouths are also teeming with deadly bacteria. The reason Ronald's right hand was all bandaged up was because a week before his death, one of his lizards had bitten him. The bacteria from that bite had seeped into the wound, causing a horrible staph infection. And it was that raging, untreated staph infection that, a week later, had made him feel so sick. It was what very likely caused him to pass out and collapse against his apartment door. And after that, once he was unconscious and helpless on the floor, his hungry pets had begun to eat him. It's assumed by investigators that he died first from the infection, and then the lizards consumed his remains. However, the autopsy was inconclusive on this point. It couldn't prove that he was already dead when they started. And so, it is entirely possible that he may have still been alive when they began to eat him. After Ronald's death was discovered, animal control was called in to handle the lizards. They were carefully removed from the apartment and eventually placed in the care of the Catoctin Wildlife Preserve and Zoo in Thurmont, Maryland. From the time Gareth Williams was a young boy growing up in Wales, his parents knew he was not just smart, he was exceptionally gifted. His mind worked on a different level than other kids his age. While they were playing with toys, Gareth was devouring books on mathematics and science. His academic trajectory was nothing short of meteoric. When he was just 17 years old, he achieved a first-class honors degree in mathematics from a university in his hometown. Most people don't even start university at that age. A couple of years after that, he had earned his PhD from the University of Manchester in England. From there, he was accepted into a prestigious postgraduate course at Cambridge, one of the most famous universities in the world. It seemed he was destined for a quiet, brilliant career in academia. But he would never finish that degree at Cambridge. His incredible achievements and his rare talent for complex problem-solving had not gone unnoticed. Britain's intelligence agencies, always on the lookout for the brightest minds, had put him on their radar. They began the careful and quiet process of recruiting him. In 2001, when Gareth was 23, Britain's Government Communications Headquarters, more commonly known as GCHQ, made him an offer. GCHQ is one of Britain's three main intelligence agencies, focusing on signals, intelligence, and information assurance. They offered him a job as a codebreaker. For Gareth, who loved puzzles and complex systems, it was a dream job. He eagerly accepted, dropped out of his course at Cambridge, and moved into a modest apartment in Cheltenham. Cheltenham is a resort town about 88 miles away from London, and it's where GCHQ is headquartered. For the next 10 years, Gareth would live and work there, dedicating his genius to protecting his country's secrets. Despite being an intensely private and shy person, Gareth thrived at GCHQ. He was a highly valued member of his team. His genius in mathematics and his understanding of technology helped his group solve some of the most difficult cryptographic challenges they faced, earning them a number of Britain's highest awards for international codebreaking. He was brilliant, and his colleagues respected him for it. Then, in 2009, his work caught the attention of another, more famous intelligence agency. The Secret Intelligence Service, also known as MI6, was so impressed with Gareth's record that they offered him a job. This wasn't just another desk job. MI6 wanted to place him on a 3-year secondment. It was a rare chance for Gareth to go operational, to become a spy in the way most people think of them from movies. He would effectively become a real-life James Bond. The opportunity was too exciting to pass up, so he jumped at the chance. But shortly after taking the job and moving into a new, agency-paid apartment in London, he began to regret his decision. The culture at MI6 was a world away from the quiet academic atmosphere of GCHQ. He hated the intense, cutthroat competitiveness among the agents. He disliked the flashy culture of expensive cars and extravagant lifestyles that many of them embraced. He especially disliked the constant pressure to go out drinking and partying with coworkers every weekend. It was all part of the work hard, play hard ethos, but it wasn't who Gareth was. All he wanted to do was his job, to focus on the puzzles and the problems, and then be left alone in his private life. At GCHQ, that was perfectly acceptable. Nobody cared if he was an introvert. But at MI6, his quiet and reserved nature made him an outsider. He didn't fit in, and he was unhappy. He missed Cheltenham and his old job. He had already told his bosses he wanted to end his secondment early and return to GCHQ. Before he was scheduled to leave MI6, he took his annual 2-week vacation. But when that vacation was over, he didn't show up for work at his office in London. And for some reason, for an entire week, nobody at MI6, one of the most sophisticated spy agencies in the world, checked in on him to see where he was. It wasn't until his sister, Sari, became worried after not being able to reach him for several days that anybody started looking into his disappearance. She called the police and reported him missing. On the 23rd of August 2010, a uniformed officer was dispatched to Gareth's apartment in the Pimlico neighborhood of London to conduct a welfare check. The officer knocked on the door several times, calling out Gareth's name, but there was no answer. Following procedure, the officer located the landlord, got the key to the apartment, and let himself inside. He called out for Gareth as he entered. The first floor of the apartment was tidy, but there was no sign of him. The officer proceeded up the stairs to the second floor, still calling out Gareth's name with each step. The second floor was also empty, but there was one closed door at the end of the hallway. It was the door to the bathroom. What the officer found on the other side of that door would trigger a media firestorm and spark conspiracy theories that would make international headlines for weeks. When he opened the door, he stepped into a small, clean bathroom. Everything seemed normal except for what was in the bathtub. Sitting in the middle of the tub was a large red North Face duffel bag. And inside of that duffel bag was the badly decomposed body of Gareth Williams. The zipper of the bag was padlocked shut from the outside. The key to that padlock was found later underneath Gareth's body inside the bag. The crime scene was bizarrely clean. There were no fingerprints on the rim of the bathtub or inside it. There were no fingerprints on the bag itself, not on the fabric, not on the two zippers, and not on the padlock or the key. Gareth's iPhone was found on a nearby table, and a forensic analysis later revealed it had been wiped clean, restored to its factory settings. Investigators determined the reset had happened on August 15th. That was the last day Gareth was seen alive on CCTV footage, and it was the day that police believe he died. According to the coroner who examined Gareth's body, there were no injuries on it. There was no sign of a struggle, no defensive wounds. His toxicology report came back clean. He had no drugs or alcohol in his system. The thermostat inside Gareth's apartment had been turned up high, making the room uncomfortably hot, despite it being the middle of August. This excessive heat had drastically sped up the decomposition of his body, making it impossible for the medical examiner to determine a precise cause of death. Despite a lengthy and high-profile investigation by Scotland Yard, there has never been a conclusive determination as to what exactly happened to Gareth Williams, although there are many theories. Some believe the Russian mafia killed him. Just before his death, Gareth had been working on a case involving money laundering operations in Britain that were directly tied to Russian organized crime. This work would have certainly made him a target. Another prominent theory is that MI6 itself had something to do with his death. This theory is supported by their strange lack of action when he failed to show up for work. Why did a top-secret agency not immediately check on their missing agent? In fact, one former MI6 agent has since come out publicly to say he believes there was a cover-up. He was interviewed by CNN and stated that he believed MI6 agents had gone into Gareth's apartment before the police arrived and had cleaned the scene, wiping it down to remove any fingerprints and DNA evidence that might have implicated them. The last major theory, and the one that the authorities eventually settled on, is that Gareth did this to himself accidentally. During the investigation, it was discovered that he made occasional visits to bondage and claustrophilia websites. There was also an anecdote from his landlord who said that on at least one occasion, Gareth had to call out for help because he had tied his own wrists to his bed frame and couldn't get himself undone. The theory was that he had climbed into the bag as part of some sort of escapology or sexual ritual and had become trapped. But this theory has a massive flaw. During the inquest into his death, two experts, both skilled escapologists, attempted to replicate the scenario. They tried to get inside a similar-sized duffel bag, zip it up, and padlock it from the outside. They tried over 400 times and failed every single time. They concluded it was impossible for Gareth to have done it alone. And even if, by some miracle, he had managed to get inside the bag and lock it, how could he have done so without leaving a single fingerprint on the bag, the lock, the zippers, or the bathtub? When his body was found, he wasn't wearing any gloves. Ultimately, despite all the red flags and the sheer impossibility of the official explanation, Gareth Williams' death was ruled to be probably an accident, and the case was officially closed 3 years after he was found. Growing up, Pauline Dakin always had a nagging feeling that there was something just a little bit off about her family. It was a sense of unease she couldn't quite put her finger on, a shadow of anxiety that seemed to follow them everywhere. Years later, she would find out that her childhood instincts were absolutely right. In 1970, when she was just 5 years old, her parents, Ruth and Warren, separated. For Pauline, this wasn't a huge shock. Her father, Warren, was a heavy drinker, and his temper could be explosive. The house was often filled with tension. But after the separation, when Pauline, her mother, and her older brother moved into a different house on the other side of Vancouver, Canada, things didn't get better. In fact, Pauline noticed her mom started to act even more anxious, almost paranoid, all the time. But she never explained why. When Pauline was 9, her mother gathered her and her brother in the living room and announced they were going on a surprise vacation to Winnipeg, a city over 1,000 miles away. They packed up the van, hopped in, and started the long drive across the country. When they finally arrived, they pulled up to a small house, their supposed vacation home. But once they were inside, Ruth sat her children down and informed them that this was not a vacation. This was their new home. They were never going back to Vancouver. Pauline and her brother were devastated. "Why?" they asked. "Dad is still back in Vancouver." "We want to see Dad." But their mother's face was grim. She just said, "I'm sorry, kids. This is just the way it has to be. When you're old enough, I promise I will explain everything." Confused, sad, and missing their father, Pauline and her brother had no choice but to start a new life in Winnipeg. Over the next 4 years, Pauline never saw her father and eventually lost touch with him. She slowly started to adjust to her new life, making a couple of close friends at her new school. She was just beginning to feel like Winnipeg was home. But right as she was starting to feel a sense of normalcy, her mother announced once again that they needed to move. Immediately. This time, they were going all the way to New Brunswick on the far eastern coast of Canada. Their mother made them swear an oath of absolute secrecy. They were not to tell anyone, not a single soul, about the move. But later that day, Pauline was with her best friend Wendy, and the secret just slipped out. She couldn't help it. So when Ruth came to pick Pauline up from Wendy's house, the two girls had to stage a very casual, breezy goodbye, pretending like they would see each other at school the next day, all so that Pauline's mother wouldn't suspect she had broken her promise. Once they were in New Brunswick, the family finally seemed to put down roots. They stayed there for many years. But her mother's strange anxiety never went away. She was still paranoid about something, always looking over her shoulder. The kids just had no idea what it was. Fast forward to 1988. Pauline was now 23 years old. She had moved out of the family home and was living with her boyfriend about 2 hours away. She was working as a reporter for a local newspaper. One day, her mother called her with a strange request. "I'd like to meet you at a motel," she said. "I'm finally ready to tell you everything. The truth about your childhood." Pauline was intrigued and a little nervous, but mostly excited. This was the conversation she had been waiting for literally decades. So Pauline eagerly drove to the motel. When she arrived, she saw her mother pacing anxiously in the parking lot. She walked up to her mom with a smile, about to say hello, when her mother suddenly looked at her, put a single finger to her lips, shushing her. Then, her mother jammed a plain white envelope into Pauline's hands. Scrawled on the front of the envelope were a few words. "Don't say anything. Put your jewelry inside of this envelope. It's probably bugged. I will explain everything inside. Just please don't speak." Pauline was completely bewildered, but she did as she was told. She took off her watch and her rings, put them in the envelope, and handed it back to her mother. The two of them then walked silently into the motel and into the room her mother had rented. When they went inside, a man was sitting in a chair in the middle of the room. Pauline recognized him immediately. It was Stan Sears, the reverend from their old church back in Vancouver. Her mother had worked as his secretary for the entire time they had attended that church. Pauline had always known that her mother and Stan were very close friends. They had even kept in touch after the family left Vancouver, with Stan periodically showing up for visits in both Winnipeg and New Brunswick. So, while it was a surprise to see him there, it wasn't a total shock when Pauline's mother confessed that she and Stan had fallen in love many years ago. They had been having a secret relationship ever since their time in Vancouver. But that revelation was nothing compared to what Pauline heard next. Her mother, with Stan nodding gravely beside her, explained the real reason they had to move so many times during her childhood. It was because her father, Warren, wasn't just a violent alcoholic. He was a mobster, a key member of an organized crime syndicate in Vancouver. Right after she and Warren separated, her mother found out that the mob had put a hit out on her. They believed that since her husband could no longer control her, she was a liability who knew too much. Stan then explained that he also had a hit on his head. The mob knew about his relationship with Ruth. On top of that, Stan had been providing pastoral counseling to a man in his congregation who, it turned out, was also a mobster. The mob believed this man had confessed critical secrets to Stan, making him an even bigger liability. At first, Stan said he didn't believe it. It sounded too crazy. But then he found out that the man he had been counseling had been assassinated, found dead in the trunk of his car. That's when he knew the threat was real. They decided they couldn't go to the police. Pauline's mother knew what happened to families who snitched on the mob. They were made into examples. So instead, they decided to go into hiding together. When Pauline and her family moved to Winnipeg and then to New Brunswick, Stan had secretly moved there as well, living nearby under the radar. That's why Pauline would see him show up periodically to visit. Pauline was in a state of complete shock, but at the same time, a strange sense of relief washed over her. It was a crazy explanation, but it was an explanation. It made sense of all the strange, terrifying things from her childhood. Over the next several hours, Pauline sat in that motel room with her mother and Stan and asked them every question she could think of. She learned that the time she came home from school to find her mother frantically throwing out all the food in the fridge and pantry, that was because they had received a tip that the mob had tried to poison them. These 6 different times she was suddenly unenrolled from her school and moved to another one across town, that was because there was a credible threat that the mob had discovered where she was. By the end of the weekend, Pauline had not only learned about this totally insane past, she also learned that she was still in danger. Before she left, she asked her mother and Stan what she should do to stay safe. Her mother explained that this was the real reason they had called her there. After all these years, they were tired of hiding. They had finally gone to the authorities and had been moved into a special, off-the-books witness protection program for families connected to organized crime. She said that when you enter this program, it's referred to as entering the weird world. You're not completely safe, but you have undercover agents following you at all times, monitoring you to make sure there are no assassination attempts. And before Pauline could even ask, her mother told her that as part of their entry into the weird world, they had requested that a couple of agents be assigned to monitor both Pauline and her brother, even though they didn't know about it. At this point, Stan leaned forward and handed her a small radio. He told her it was a special device that broadcast directly to the agents who were supposedly following her. He warned her to only use it in a truly desperate situation because as soon as she called for help, people would be risking their lives to save her. As Pauline held the radio, she looked at her mom and Stan and asked, "What happened to Dad? Is he in jail?" Her mother shook her head. "No," she said. "He's in the weird world too." She then handed Pauline a letter. It was from her father, addressed to her. It basically explained that he had also been moved into the weird world and that he was looking forward to Pauline joining them when she was ready. So now Pauline was standing there holding this radio and this letter from her supposedly mob-connected father, completely overwhelmed. Her mother just told her, "Go home. Think about what you want to do. If you want to join the program and enter the weird world with us, just let me know and we'll make it happen." Pauline, still in a total state of shock, gave her mom and Stan a hug and said she would be in touch. She left the motel and got into her car. She was about to back out when she saw Stan running out of the motel room holding something in his hand. She stopped and Stan ran up to her window. "Hey, I forgot to give you this," he said. He held up a round, flat piece of metal. He told her it was a magnetized GPS transponder. She should stick it somewhere out of sight underneath her car. He explained that it constantly transmitted her location to the agents following her, so it would be easier for them to find her if she was in trouble. Pauline thanked him, took the device, and placed it under her car. Stan went back into the motel. Pauline drove home with the intention of just taking a few days to process this insane information. Her plan was to think it over before committing to joining this weird world, but after only a couple of days, her paranoia was through the roof. Every shadow seemed like a threat. Every car behind her seemed to be following her. She dumped her boyfriend, quit her job, and moved out of her house into a new, secret apartment. She called her mother and said, "I can't take it anymore. I feel totally unsafe. I want to join the weird world." Her mother and Anne delighted. They told her it was a complicated process, but they would get it started. During this waiting period, Pauline met a new man named Kevin, who would eventually become her husband. As she talked to him about her situation, sharing the wild story, she started to have doubts. The more she said it out loud, the less real it sounded. She decided she needed to know for sure. She had to set up a sting operation on her own mother. So, Pauline called her mother, her voice filled with fake panic. "Mom! Oh my goodness, someone just broke into my apartment. I think it was the mob. I don't know what to do. Should I call the police?" Her mother immediately responded, "No. Whatever you do, don't call the police. I'm going to get in touch with Stan and see what his contacts say." A few minutes later, her mother called back, her voice calm. "Okay, honey, I spoke to Stan. He spoke to the undercover agents who are parked outside your house. They said, yes, 2 men from the mafia did break into your house. But don't worry. The agents went in and grabbed them. They're in custody now. You're safe." And in that moment, Pauline's world shattered for a second time. She told her mom, "Mom, I made that up. No one's been in my apartment. I've been here all day. I lied to you." It was then that Pauline finally understood. Her mother and Stan had been living a complete lie since she was 5 years old. There was no mafia. Her father was not a mobster. It was all a fantasy. It would turn out that Stan was suffering from a rare psychiatric condition called delusional disorder, where an otherwise high-functioning person has one specific, unshakable delusion. His delusion was that the mafia was after him. And over the years of their close relationship, he had passed that delusion on to Pauline's mother through a phenomenon called folie à deux, or shared delusional disorder, where a dominant personality can transfer a delusion to a more subordinate one. After confronting both her mother and Stan, neither of them ever admitted it was a lie. They couldn't. They truly believed it. To their dying day, they believed the mafia was after them. Their biggest concern after Pauline exposed the lie was not that they had been caught, but that Pauline was now in grave danger because she was no longer taking precautions. They were terrified she would be assassinated by the mafia. Pauline never got an apology or a real conversation about the damage this decades-long lie had caused, but she ultimately found a way to make peace with her bizarre past. She wrote about her experience in a best-selling memoir titled Run, Hide, Repeat. On the 15th of September 2010, a 55-year-old man named Greg Flanagan checked into the Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas. It was a Monday, the start of his work week. As a young man, Greg had lived a life of adventure, working as a chief engineer on massive ocean-going vessels, spending months at a time out at sea. But in his middle age, he had reinvented himself as a landman. It was his job to travel around and secure leases for mineral rights and land for drilling operations. He was slender and looked fit, which was surprising considering he never exercised and had been a chain smoker for most of his life. He kept a close-cropped white beard and had the tanned, weathered skin of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors. Every Monday morning, Greg would make the 2-hour drive in his pickup truck from his home in Lafayette, Louisiana, all the way to Beaumont, Texas, where his company would always put him up in a room at the Elegante. The hotel was nothing special, not fancy, but not a dive either. To Greg, it didn't matter. All he needed was a bed to sleep in and a television to watch. His room, number 348, was simple. When you walked in, there was a small bathroom immediately to the right. A little farther in, the room opened up. Straight ahead was a window that looked down over a small courtyard pool lined with potted plants. The main space had a queen-size bed pushed up against the right wall, and on the left wall there was a dresser with a TV on top. Greg wheeled his single suitcase into the room and placed it at the foot of the bed. He unzipped it and began his weekly routine. He carefully pulled out the collared shirts he would need for the week, making sure they stayed wrinkle-free, and hung them neatly in the closet. He then took out his toiletries, which were kept in a cloth bag with a convenient hook, and he hung the bag from the towel rack in the bathroom. After unpacking, he took off his worn-in brown work boots and his faded blue jeans and slipped into a comfortable pair of pajama pants. Anytime Greg stayed at the Elegante, he rarely left his room. There was a bar downstairs in the hotel lobby, but Greg wasn't much of a drinker or a socializer. He much preferred to have quiet nights by himself, just relaxing and watching TV. So, that night, Greg walked over to the wall unit and cranked the air conditioning up as high as it would go. He liked to sleep in a room that was practically freezing cold. Then, he got into bed, but he didn't lie down. He propped 2 big pillows up against the headboard and leaned back, getting comfortable for a night of channel surfing. He took a clean towel from the bathroom and laid it out on the empty side of the bed next to him. On this towel, he methodically arranged all his nighttime essentials: his ashtray, his pack of cigarettes, his lighter, his cell phone, the TV remote, and a candy bar. Everything he needed within arm's reach. He picked up the remote, turned on the TV, and began flicking through the channels. He eventually landed on a station that was playing the movie Iron Man 2. Good enough, he probably thought to himself. He put the remote down, picked up his candy bar, and unwrapped it. He took a bite, then grabbed a cigarette from the pack, lit it, and settled in, smoking and watching the movie. The following morning, Susie Flanagan, Greg's wife, didn't get her usual morning call from her husband. Every single morning that he was away for work, without fail, Greg would call her to say good morning and check in. It was their routine, and this was a major break from it. She started to feel a little worried. She tried calling his cell phone, but it just rang and rang until it went to voicemail. He never picked up. Growing more concerned, she called his office in Beaumont. He didn't answer his desk phone either. After trying his office a second and third time, one of his coworkers finally picked up. They told her that Greg hadn't come into work yet and they hadn't heard from him. Now Susie was genuinely concerned. A knot of dread formed in her stomach. She felt like something was wrong. She asked his coworkers, "Do you mind just going over to his hotel? Can you knock on his door and just make sure he's okay?" They agreed immediately and said they would head right over. Two of his coworkers drove to the hotel. They went up to the third floor to room 348 and knocked on Greg's door. There was no answer. They knocked again, louder this time, calling his name. Still silence. They went back down to the front desk and got the hotel manager, who came up with a master key. The manager unlocked the door and pushed it open, and right away they found Greg. He was lying dead in the middle of his hotel room floor. The position of his body suggested he had fallen first to his knees and then pitched forward onto his face. His left arm was sort of tucked underneath his body, and still clutched between the first two fingers of his left hand was a cigarette that hadn't fallen. It had burned all the way down to the filter. The room was exceptionally warm, and Greg's skin had a strange grayish-blue tint. Immediately after seeing him, his coworkers called 911. Shortly after the paramedics arrived, Detective Scott Apple of the Beaumont Police Department pulled up in his cruiser. Apple was a short, very fit guy with silver hair that he wore spiked up. He looked like a cop straight out of Central Casting, and he was known for working cases relentlessly. When he got up to room 348, he saw no signs of a break-in. Nothing inside the room seemed to have been disturbed. There was no blood and no obvious wound on Greg's body, with the single exception of a slight abrasion on his cheek, likely from when he fell and hit the carpet. Detective Apple looked around the room and found Greg's wallet, still in the back pocket of his jeans, which were folded on a chair. It was full of cash. Robbery was clearly not a motive. He went back out into the hall and began interviewing the occupants of the surrounding rooms. No one had heard anything unusual. No one had seen anything suspicious. He went back into the hotel room and conducted a more thorough search, looking for any kind of drugs or any substance that Greg might have taken that could have led to his death. There was nothing. No prescription pill bottles, no illegal drugs, no alcohol. Later that day, after the family had been notified of Greg's passing, his grief-stricken wife, Susie, called Detective Apple. Through her tears, she told him, "You know, my husband did not take good care of himself. He had a terrible diet. He's been smoking like a chimney since he was a teenager, and he never went to see a doctor. I always told him if he wasn't careful, something like this was going to happen. I always worried that he might have a heart attack or something." At this point, everyone involved was thinking the same thing. Greg's family thought he had died of natural causes, and Detective Apple agreed. Based on everything he had seen at the scene, there was absolutely no evidence of foul play. It just looked like a tragic case of a man whose unhealthy lifestyle had finally caught up with him. Greg's body was sent to the Jefferson County morgue to be examined by Dr. Tommy Brown, who was the local medical examiner. He was a veteran pathologist who had seen just about everything. Doctor Brown had read the preliminary report, which suggested Greg had likely died of a massive heart attack. When Greg's body was wheeled in, there was nothing on initial visual inspection that contradicted that theory. The only two marks, Doctor. Brown noted on the outside of Greg's body were the small abrasion on his face from the fall and another very small, almost insignificant abrasion on his crotch. Beyond that, his body was completely unblemished. There were no bruises, no cuts, no signs of a struggle. But when Dr. Brown began the internal examination, the case took a shocking turn. It looked like someone had literally crushed Greg's insides. His entire torso was filled with blood. Food from his intestines had been ripped out and was loose inside his abdominal cavity. He had multiple broken ribs, several of his internal organs were lacerated, and there was a small, neat hole in his heart. Dr. Brown was completely baffled. The severity of Greg's internal injuries was more consistent with someone who had been in a severe car crash or had a multi-ton object fall on them. But Greg didn't have any of the corresponding external injuries that would support those scenarios. And he was found in the middle of a locked hotel room where nothing was disturbed and no one had seen or heard a thing. Dr. Brown concluded his report stating, "Look, I don't have all the answers here, but this was not a natural death. This is a homicide. My best guess is he was beaten to death." I know it doesn't quite make sense because there are no external injuries, but he suffered some kind of significant blunt force trauma from another person, and that is what killed him. When Detective Apple received this report from the medical examiner, he was just as confused as Dr. Brown was. But now he had a murder on his hands. His focus shifted immediately. If Greg was murdered, who would want to kill him? He started digging into Greg's background, interviewing friends, family, and coworkers. He found that Greg was universally liked. He was known for being incredibly courteous and polite. He was a quiet man who kept to himself. He was deeply in love with his wife, and she loved him back. There was no evidence of any secret life, no gambling debts, no affairs, no scandals in his past. He was just a genuinely nice, normal guy. It made absolutely no sense why anyone would want to kill him, let alone with such bizarre, unexplainable violence. After a few months, the investigation had gone nowhere. In reality, it had never even really gotten started, because there was no logical starting point. The only odd detail from the crime scene that Apple kept coming back to was that the room was unusually warm when the body was found, which was the opposite of how Greg liked to keep it. But a warm room didn't explain why his insides were crushed. And so, with no leads and no suspects, Apple was about to put the case on the back burner when he made a small discovery. He was reviewing hotel records and found in the maintenance logs that on the night Greg died, he had been making popcorn in his room's microwave and had somehow managed to blow a fuse. It wasn't just his power either. The blown fuse had also cut the power to the room on his right, the room on his left, and the room directly below him. The log showed that Greg had called the front desk and a maintenance man had been sent up to reset the breaker. This opened up two new, albeit weak, theories for Detective Apple. The first was that the maintenance man, who did have a minor criminal record, had attacked Greg when he went up to fix the breaker. But this was wildly speculative. There was no evidence and no motive, so it was quickly ruled out. The second theory involved Greg's neighbors in room 349. They were two electricians who were in town for a job. They were known to be heavy drinkers and partiers. Apple theorized that maybe when Greg accidentally cut the power to their room, they got angry. Maybe they went out into the hall, saw Greg, and figured out he was to blame. And then, in a drunken rage, they attacked him, killing him. It was a stretch, but it was the closest thing to a potential motive Apple had found. So, Detective Apple put on a hidden camera and went to interview the two electricians again. When he spoke to them, they were very forthcoming. They seemed honest and were appropriately curious and concerned about what had happened to Greg. They told Apple, "Look, we had no interaction with him at all. We did hear him coughing next door when we came back from the bar that night, but honestly, that's it. The electricians voluntarily offered up their cell phone numbers and email addresses, telling the detective that if he needed anything at all, they would be happy to help." Apple left the interview feeling they were telling the truth. At this point, Detective Apple was back at square one. The one promising lead he had, the maintenance log, had turned out to be a total dead end. With no other avenues to explore, the case went cold. 7 months after Greg's death, with absolutely no progress made, Susie decided she couldn't just let it go. She wanted to hire a private investigator. A friend suggested she call Ken Brennan, a famous private detective who was known for solving a lot of very complex, seemingly unsolvable cases. On a whim, Susie looked up his number and called, not really expecting to get through to him. But to her surprise, he picked up the phone himself. She told him the whole confusing story of what had happened to her husband, and Ken said he was intrigued. He would take the case. Ken was a former Long Island cop and a retired DEA special agent. He spoke with a thick New York accent and wore t-shirts that were just a little too tight, showing off his muscles, often paired with a big, gaudy gold chain. He looked more like a character from a mob movie than a detective. As soon as he agreed to take the case, he flew to Lafayette, Louisiana to meet Susie. He sat down with her and asked a lot of tough questions about her marriage, about whether Greg might have been cheating, if he had any kind of secret life she didn't know about. After he was satisfied that those were all dead ends, he asked her, "Can you tell me anything about the crime scene that stood out to you? Anything that seemed off?" Susie thought for a moment and said, "Yes. Greg always kept the air conditioning on freezing cold at night. So I thought it was really strange that when his coworkers found him, the AC was off and the room was hot. That is so unlike Greg." Ken made a note of this. Then he flew to Beaumont to meet with Detective Apple. The two men, despite their different styles, actually got along very well. Apple, feeling like he had hit a wall anyway, agreed to work with Ken on the case. He took Ken to the hotel, showed him room 348, and then turned over his entire case file. The autopsy report, the crime scene photos, all of his notes. That night, Ken went through every single document, every photograph. The next day, he walked into Apple's office and said, "I think I figured it out." Apple was skeptical. "Really? You figured it out in one day?" Ken insisted. "No, seriously. I have to confirm one thing with his wife, but I have a theory." Right there in front of Apple, Ken called Susie. When she answered, Ken asked her a simple question. "Hey, did your husband ever smoke with his left hand, or did he always use his right hand?" Susie replied without hesitation, "Oh no, he only ever smoked with his right hand." Ken said, "Thank you very much," hung up the phone, and turned to Apple. "I got it," he said. Apple leaned forward, listening intently. Ken laid out his theory. "Okay, so Susie told me it was very strange that the room wasn't cold. We know from the maintenance log that the power went out and was restored at 8:30 p.m. When the power came back on, the TV would have come back on, but the air conditioning unit would not have automatically restarted. The room would have still been cold from being air conditioned all evening, so Greg probably wouldn't have noticed right away that the AC was off. He just went back to watching TV. But this is Beaumont in the summer. That room would have gotten hot really quickly. He would have noticed within about 30 minutes and gotten up to turn the AC back on. Since the AC was off when he was found, he must have died after the power came back on at 8:30, but before the room got warm enough for him to notice. That puts his time of death somewhere between 8:30 and 9 p.m. Apple was impressed. "That's pretty good," he said, "but it doesn't tell us how he died or who killed him." Ken held up a hand. "I'm building the picture," he said. Next, the cigarette. It was found in his left hand, but his wife confirmed he was a right-handed smoker. So what I think happened is he's sitting on the bed, smoking with his right hand. Then something catastrophic happens to him. He jumps off the bed and starts heading for the door to get help. He transfers the lit cigarette from his right hand to his left hand so he can use his dominant right hand to open the doorknob. But he doesn't make it. He collapses and dies, the cigarette still in his left hand. Apple nodded. It makes a lot of sense. But what was the catastrophic event? Ken smiled. "I have a theory on that too. But I need to go back to the hotel room." So Apple and Ken went back to room 348. Ken walked inside and started examining everything, looking at the ceiling, the floor, the walls. Finally, he stopped, looking at the wall by the entryway. He pointed to a spot on the wall. "There," he said. Apple looked. It looked like a small spackled patch on the wall, right around where the doorknob would hit if the door swung open too hard. "That's just from the doorknob," Apple said. Ken shook his head. He took the door and swung it open all the way until the doorknob pressed against the wall. The point of impact was several inches to the right of the patch. The patch was not from the doorknob. Before Apple could ask what he was thinking, Ken was already on the move. He went next door, to room 349, the electrician's room. They went inside, and Ken started running his hands all over the shared wall, feeling for any imperfections. Eventually, he stopped. He looked up at Apple, then took his index finger and pushed on one specific spot on the wall. As Apple watched, Ken's finger went right through. He had pushed out a small plug of dried toothpaste that had been used to conceal a tiny hole in the wall. Apple immediately called in a crime scene unit. They carefully excavated both sides of the wall and then shined a laser from the hole in room 349 into Greg's room. The trajectory of the laser beam lined up perfectly with where Greg would have been sitting up in bed watching TV. Ken and Apple went back to the medical examiner, Dr. Brown, and told him, "Look, you missed something." Greg was shot. Greg's body had already been cremated, but they still had the detailed autopsy photos. They looked at them again, and sure enough, that tiny, insignificant abrasion on his crotch was actually a small caliber bullet entrance wound. And the hole Dr. Brown had found in Greg's heart was perfectly aligned with the bullet's trajectory. Dr. Brown realized his mistake and amended the autopsy report to reflect death by a gunshot wound. With this new, undeniable evidence, Ken and Detective Apple brought in Lance, one of the electricians from room 349, for another interview. They told him it was just a routine follow-up. They had him sign a sworn statement reattesting to his original story that he hadn't seen or heard anything. Lance read it over and said, "Yeah, that's right. I wish I knew more to help you." He signed the document. The second he put the pen down, Ken leaned forward and said, "All right, we got you. We know a gunshot was fired from your room that night, and that's what killed Greg Flanagan. So you need to start talking, or you're going to jail right now for filing a false police report." Lance crumbled. The whole truth came pouring out. He said that he and the other electrician, Muller, had been drinking heavily that night. Muller had gone out to his truck and brought his pistol back into the room. He was drunk and goofing around with it, waving it around. Lance said he told him to stop, but Muller kept playing with it, at one point even aiming it at Lance. Lance said he batted the gun away, and Muller dropped it. The gun hit the floor and went off. They saw the bullet hole in the wall leading into the next room. They both froze and listened. They didn't hear a scream, no sound at all. After a few minutes of silence, they convinced themselves that the room next door must be empty and that they had gotten away with it. So they just left and went to the bar. When they came back later that night, they heard Greg coughing next door, which further convinced them that he must have come back to his room after the gunshot and was perfectly fine. The next day, when they saw Greg's body being carried out on a gurney, they panicked, thinking they had killed him. But then they overheard Detective Apple talking to other officers in the hallway, saying that it looked like natural causes, probably a heart attack. They were flooded with relief. They actually believed it was just a bizarre coincidence that Greg had a heart attack on the same night they fired a bullet into his room. But deep down, Lance admitted they knew they were probably responsible. So they covered their tracks. They plugged the bullet hole with toothpaste and hid the gun. Ultimately, Muller, the owner of the gun and the one who had been waving it around, was charged with manslaughter. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. On the 27th of April, 1997, a farmer in a rural part of Indonesia was walking his livestock through a thick, dense sugarcane field near his house when he stumbled, tripping hard on something hidden in the dirt. After he caught his balance, he looked down to see what he had tripped over. It was a strange mound of freshly turned earth that seemed completely out of place in the otherwise flat field. His curiosity was piqued, and he wanted to dig it up to see what was underneath, but he knew he wasn't on his own property. So instead, he turned around, led his livestock back to his village, and went to find the village leader. He told him about the strange pile of dirt and suggested someone should go and see what was buried there. The village leader gathered some other men, and they all headed back out to the sugarcane field. They found the mound of dirt exactly where the farmer said it would be. The first thing they did was take a long, sturdy stick and poke it into the pile. The stick slid easily into the soft dirt. When they pulled it back out, a horrible, sickening stench billowed out from the hole, filling the air around them. It was the unmistakable smell of decay. Worried about what they might find, the men decided to leave it alone. They went back to the village and reported the strange, smelly mound to the local authorities. The authorities, however, told them to go back out there, dig up the mound, and report back on what they found. So, the village leader and a few more men returned to the field, this time armed with shovels. They began to dig into the soft earth. Pretty quickly, their shovels struck something soft, buried just beneath the surface. They put their shovels down and started digging carefully with their hands. After clearing away a bit more dirt, they uncovered a human face looking right back at them. It was a woman. It appeared she had been buried vertically in a hole up to her neck, and then someone had just piled dirt on top of her head. At this point, the authorities were called again, and this time they came out to the scene. They were able to excavate the body and identify her as a 1-year-old local woman named Dewey. After asking around the village, police determined that the last time anyone had seen Dewey alive was 3 days earlier when she had left her house to run an errand. After that, she had simply vanished. No one knew what had happened to her. Just a few hours after Dewey's body was discovered, a 5-year-old boy who worked as a rickshaw driver came to the police station. He had information. He told the police that 3 days earlier, on the evening of April 24th, the same day Dewey was last seen, she had hired him for a ride. When she got into his rickshaw, he asked her where she wanted to go. She was very secretive. She told him she didn't want to tell him her specific destination. Instead, she just told him to drive in a particular direction, and she would give him more instructions as they got closer. This really intrigued the young driver. After he had been driving for a while, he turned to her again and pressed her for more information. "This is very strange," he said. "Can you please tell me where we are going?" Finally, Dewey relented. She leaned forward and whispered that she was going to see the shaman. In that culture, a shaman is someone who is believed to use magic to cure the sick and solve people's problems. The driver thought it was a bit odd that she was going to see the shaman in the middle of the night and being so secretive about it, but he didn't think too much of it after he dropped her off. That is, until he heard that she had been found dead. The police immediately went to the home of the local shaman, a 5-year-old man named Ahmad Siraji. They asked him if he had been with Dewey on the night of April 24th. At first, Siraji denied it completely. He said he hadn't seen her and had no idea what happened to her. But after the police got a warrant and searched his house, they found some of Dewey's personal belongings hidden inside. Confronted with this evidence, Siraji's story changed. "Okay," he said, "I have been lying. I have a confession to make." And then, in a chillingly nonchalant tone, he told the police that not only had he killed Dewey, but he had also killed dozens of other women in the exact same way, and he had buried all of them in that same sugarcane field. The police, stunned by this confession, went back out to the field and began a systematic search. They found dozens of mounds of dirt, just like the one Dewey was found in, scattered all over the property. Underneath each one, they found the body of a woman buried up to her neck. After the excavation was complete, the police believed they had found the bodies of 42 different women. But in truth, that was just a guess. They believed there could be even more. During his trial, Ahmad Siraji explained in detail why he did what he did. He said that back in 1986, 11 years earlier, he had a vivid dream. In the dream, his deceased father came to him and gave him a set of instructions. His father told him that if he drank the saliva of 70 women, he would become a powerful and immortal healer. When Siraji woke up, he didn't dismiss it as just a strange dream. He believed he had received a genuine spiritual command from his father's spirit. He decided he would do as he was told. But his father hadn't explained how he was supposed to get the saliva from these 70 women. After thinking about it for a few days, Siraji decided that the most efficient way to complete his task would be to kill the women and then forcibly take their saliva. To find his victims, Siraji began spreading a rumor throughout his village that he was a shaman with supernatural powers. He claimed he could grant women everlasting beauty and make them rich. And in his community, many people believed him. As the rumor spread to surrounding areas, women began to come to him requesting his services. He would tell them to come back to his house late at night when it was completely dark and to not tell anyone where they were going. When a woman arrived, she would come inside his house and pay him a fee, which was roughly equivalent to $300. Then he would tell her that he needed to perform a special ritual to grant her beauty and riches. He would lead the woman out of his house through a nearby cemetery and into the dark sugarcane field. They would walk for a while until Siraji stopped them in a secluded spot. He would then hand the woman a shovel and tell her to dig a hole in the ground, assuring her that this was a necessary part of the ritual. So he would stand there and watch as she dug a hole until it was about waist deep. Then he would tell her to get into the hole and put her hands down by her sides. If she seemed nervous, he would calmly reassure her that this was all part of the process, that many other women had done it before, and that it was perfectly safe. Once she was in the hole with her hands at her sides, Siraji would take the shovel and begin to fill the hole back in with dirt, packing it tightly around her until she was completely immobilized from the waist down. At this point, with the woman trapped and helpless, Siraji would pull out a length of electrical cable. He would wrap it around her neck and strangle her to death. Once she was dead, he would drink her saliva. Then he would dig the hole a little bit deeper, put the body back inside, and bury her completely, making sure that her head was oriented so that her face was looking towards his house. He believed that having the spirits of these women constantly looking at him gave him more power. He said that in Dewey's case, when she first came to his house and paid the fee, she got scared. She was worried about going out into the dark field to do the ritual. So Siraji told her to wait. He went into another room where his 3 wives were and told one of them, "Hey, I'm gonna go kill this girl and I need your help. I need you to go calm her down." His wife, who he claimed had no idea her husband was a serial killer, immediately went along with it. She went into the other room and assured Dewey that everything was totally fine, that they had done this ritual many times before, and that it was perfectly safe. She even offered to come along with them. At this, Dewey felt much more calm and agreed to go. The trio left the house, walked through the cemetery, and out to the field. Only 2 of them came back. Ahmad Siraji was executed in 2008 by a firing squad. His wife, who acted as his accomplice, was sentenced to life in prison. On the 20th of July, 1968, a small fishing boat named El Fausto left its port on La Palma, one of Spain's Canary Islands, and set off for El Hierro, another island about 50 miles to the south. On board were 3 very experienced sailors, the brothers Ramon and Eliberto Hernandez, and their cousin Miguel Acosta. Their trip to El Hierro was smooth and uneventful. It took them about 7 hours. They arrived at the port in the early evening and unloaded their cargo, which was actually a shipment of explosives used for agricultural purposes. After the cargo was unloaded, the three of them went into town to get some food and relax for a bit before heading back to the dock to prepare for their return journey. Later that evening, as the three men were on their boat, stowing their gear and getting ready to depart, they saw a man running down the dock, waving his arms frantically to get their attention. They stopped what they were doing and called out to him, asking what he needed. The man, out of breath, introduced himself as Julio Garcia. He was clearly very upset and was talking so quickly that they had to ask him to slow down. He explained that his wife had called him earlier that day from their home on La Palma. Their 2-year-old daughter was very sick, and he needed to get home immediately. He had rushed to the port to catch the last ferry back to La Palma, the same island the three fishermen were from, but he had missed it. The next ferry wasn't scheduled for another 2 days. So Julio had been running up and down the dock, desperately trying to find anyone with a boat who might be willing to take him to La Palma. He was prepared to pay whatever it cost. Of course, the crew of El Fausto immediately told him not to worry. They were heading to La Palma anyway, as it was their home port, and they would be happy to give him a ride. They told him he didn't need to pay them anything. Relieved, Julio thanked them profusely and began helping them load the rest of their supplies onto the boat. They had some food, about 22 pounds of fruit, and a supply of fresh water. Once everything was loaded, they untied their lines from the dock and set sail for La Palma. They departed at about 2:30 inches the morning on July 21st. The water was calm during their return trip. The only weather they had to contend with was a light mist that formed over the water in the early morning hours after the sun came up, but it wasn't thick enough to affect their ability to navigate. And even if the fog had been more severe, Ramon, Eliberto, and Miguel were seasoned sailors who had been navigating these exact waters since they were teenagers. They had sailed in far worse conditions and always made it home safely. But at 10 a.m. that morning, the scheduled arrival time for El Fausto in La Palma, the boat didn't appear. The owner of the boat was waiting at the dock for them. When they didn't show up on time, he wasn't overly concerned. He knew the three men well and trusted their skills. In fact, he normally would have gone on the trip with them, but he had other commitments on the island. He figured they had probably run into some minor mechanical issue. El Fausto was an old boat, and it had had problems in the past, but after a little while, the families of the crew started to gather at the dock, asking the owner where their loved ones were. The owner, still not particularly worried, but wanting to reassure the families, decided to take action. He told them, "I'll send a search boat out. They'll take the exact same route El Fausto was on, just in reverse. I'm sure they'll run right into them and help them fix whatever problem they're having." So a search boat was sent out. For hours and hours, it motored along the exact charted course that El Fausto was supposed to be on, but they were nowhere to be found. The search boat radioed back to the owner and said, "We can't find them." "What do you want us to do?" He called them back in. He realized that if they weren't anywhere near their route, then something more serious must have happened. It was at this point that he contacted the authorities, and a much larger, more formal search and rescue effort was launched. Planes and boats fanned out over the sea to look for El Fausto and her 4-man crew. Everyone involved in the search was operating with a huge sense of urgency. They had been told that the men on board had very limited supplies, just 22 pounds of fruit and a small amount of fresh water. If they weren't found within a couple of days, the chances of finding them alive were slim. But despite the massive search effort, a couple of days passed with no sign of the boat. Hopes began to fade. People started to fear the worst. But then, on July 25th, 4 days after El Fausto had vanished, a British ship called the Duquesa radioed in an incredible message. They had found a small fishing boat drifting aimlessly in the open ocean. There were 4 people standing on the deck waving flashlights to get their attention, As the British ship got closer, they were able to read the name on the hull. It was El Fausto. El Fausto had been found about 120 miles west of La Palma. They had drifted way, way off course. But when the Duquesa pulled up alongside them, they could see that all 4 crew members were alive. In fact, they seemed to be in relatively good spirits. They were certainly dehydrated and starving and very grateful for the water and food the British sailors gave them. They were obviously a bit shaken up from being lost at sea, but beyond that, they seemed okay. That message was quickly relayed back to the friends and family waiting anxiously on La Palma. When they were told that the men had been found and were alive, there was a huge celebration. They had all thought their loved ones were dead. But a couple of hours after that first joyous transmission from the Duquesa, a second, very strange message came through. The captain of the Duquesa reported that the crew of El Fausto was refusing to be towed back to shore. They were insisting that their boat was fine and that they just needed a few supplies and they would be on their way. The captain of the Duquesa was baffled. He asked them, "Then why are you out here? How did you end up 120 miles off course? Something must have gone wrong with your boat." But the men were evasive. They just said, "No, there's nothing wrong with the boat. No mechanical issues. Everything's fine. We appreciate the offer, but we don't need a tow." Even Julio, the man who had been so desperate to get home to his sick daughter, was saying the same thing. "No, we're good. We don't need a tow." The captain of the Duquesa couldn't believe what he was hearing. He thought, "What am I missing here? You drifted 120 miles out into the Atlantic. You're incredibly lucky we found you. You probably would have died of dehydration in a few days. We are offering to guarantee your safety, to bring you home to your families, and you're telling us to leave?" But he could not convince them. They were polite but firm. They just needed some food, water, cigarettes, and a little bit of fuel. And so ultimately, the crew of the Duquesa gave them what they asked for. They provided them with enough fuel for about 18 hours of travel, along with plenty of supplies. The British sailors watched as the 4 men on El Fausto started their engine, waved goodbye, and sailed off to the east towards La Palma. The captain of the Duquesa radioed the authorities on La Palma and told them that based on their location and speed, El Fausto should be expected to arrive in port at around 7 p.m. that evening. Back on La Palma, a huge party started at the dock. Friends, family, and hundreds of other islanders gathered, drinking wine and celebrating the imminent return of the 4 men. But 7 p.m. came and went, and El Fausto did not appear. As the hours ticked by, the festive atmosphere turned to one of deep worry. The nightmare was starting all over again. The next morning, El Fausto and her crew were once again declared missing. This time, Spain launched the largest search operation in its history. Military bombers, Coast Guard ships, and civilian vessels scoured the area where the Duquesa had last seen them. For 2 weeks, they searched relentlessly, but they found nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no sign of the boat or its crew. Finally, the search was called off. The 4 men were declared lost at sea. 2 months later, on October 9th, an Italian merchant ship called the Ana di Mayo was on its way to Venezuela when it spotted a small fishing boat bobbing aimlessly in the distance. The boat was far too small to be making a transatlantic voyage. As they got closer, they could see that there was no one on deck and no one in the cabin. When they were close enough to read the name on the hull, they saw it was El Fausto. The Ana di Mayo pulled up alongside the fishing boat and tied it off. 2 of the Italian sailors boarded El Fausto, calling out to see if anyone was there, but they were met with silence. The boat itself was in surprisingly good condition. There was no sign of damage or violence. They went into the cabin looking for a logbook that might explain what had happened, but there was none. The sailors were left scratching their heads. How could a perfectly seaworthy boat end up abandoned in the middle of the Atlantic? Where was the crew? They still needed to check the small space below deck that housed the engine. The two sailors found the hatch on the deck, opened it up, and peered down into the darkness. A horrible smell wafted up. They shone a flashlight down and were met with a gruesome and inexplicable sight. Lying on his back on the floor of the engine room was the body of a dead man. He was partially mummified. He had no clothes on, and he was clutching a small transistor radio to his chest. The sailors reeled back in shock. After composing themselves, one of them climbed down into the engine room to look for more clues. There was only the one body. But tucked behind the body, he found a small notebook. The sailors took the notebook back to their ship and opened it. The first thing they noticed was that a large section in the middle of the notebook had been torn out. 28 pages were missing. All that was left were a few pages at the beginning and a single page at the end. The first few pages contained only some simple notes and math calculations. The last page appeared to be some kind of farewell message, but the handwriting was difficult to read and the language was a bit confusing. The captain of the Ana de Mayo radioed Spanish authorities, informing them that they had found El Fausto and that they intended to tow it with them to Venezuela, where they would turn over everything to the authorities. They attached a tow line to the bow of El Fausto and began their journey. 2 days later, the Spanish authorities received a crushing telegram from the Italian ship. The night before, as El Fausto was being towed, it had suddenly lurched forward, its bow plunging down into the water. It sank so rapidly that it snapped the thick tow line and disappeared beneath the waves before the Italian crew could do anything to stop it. The boat and the body inside it were now gone forever, lost at the bottom of the Atlantic. All that remained was the small notebook. The notebook was sent to La Palma and shown to the families of the 4 men. Julio's wife immediately identified the handwriting as his. This meant the dead man in the engine room was almost certainly Julio. His wife was able to decipher most of the final page. It was a detailed list of instructions for her on what to do after his death. It listed his insurance policies and properties. And then, at the very bottom of the page, he had scrawled one last cryptic message. Don't ever tell our son all that has happened to me. You know that God wanted this fate. Love you. If Julio knew he was about to die, why didn't he write down what had happened? He had to have known that whoever found his body in this notebook would have so many questions. Unless, of course, he did write it all down, and the explanation was in those 28 pages that were torn out of the middle of the notebook. If so, who removed them, and why? And where were the other 3 men? Why did they refuse a tow that would have guaranteed their safety? For over 50 years, these questions have remained unanswered. The most widely accepted theory is that the crew simply experienced a series of compounding problems and, in a state of panic, made a series of bad decisions that led to their deaths. But others believe there are just too many strange details for it to be that simple. And so, the mystery of El Fausto and her crew endures. From a man dying in a locked hotel room, to a spy found inside a sealed bag, to a childhood built on a lie, a crew lost at sea without explanation, and a hidden horror buried beneath a perfectly normal life. Tonight we followed 5 stories that all asked the same impossible question. What really happened when no one was supposed to know? Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And if you want more stories like these, there's a whole playlist waiting for you to binge right now. Until next time.